Hello Animals fans and welcome back to AniLysis. We're doing Andalites today. And before we get stuck in, a disclaimer about what specifically we're talking about. We're not talking about the Andalite military, any perceived Andalite empire, the Andalite electorate, Andalite individuals, ranking systems, ships, anything like that. We're not talking about anything like that, not even the home world, okay? We're just specifically talking about Andalites as a race, the biological creatures, the morphology, anatomy, the culture, the lifespans, theoretically, the traditions. That's what we're talking about today. And it's still going to be a long video, so if you're in for the long haul, excellent show. If you want to split this up, the video will be split into chapters and you can come back and forth and do what you need to do. Why have you changed? Stop that straight away. Okay, let's... And my freaking camera keeps changing its hue as well. Whatever. Let's have a look at a few quotes that cover the general appearance of the Andalite. Let's build a picture now of what these creatures actually look like. My first reaction was that someone had cloned a person and a deer together. Andalites are strange looking, that's for sure, but they aren't frightening. He seemed gentle, quizzical, almost delicate. Andalites look like, as has been stated many times in the series, a cloning of a person and a deer. Okay? And they're quite dainty. They don't look scary, but nor do they look unscary. They're somewhere in between. It's like the uncanny valley of appearance. Okay? So I've got a couple of pictures here sent to me by Ghost of Essam. And so I've got this one here. So it's got the body of a deer and the upper body of a human, and it's all very dainty, and yeah, I think we've got the gist there. But we're going to start from top to bottom, so we're going to start looking at the head of this creature. Okay, so let's look at some quotes looking at this part of the body. The alien shook his big head slowly, side to side. Andalites have human-shaped heads with deer-like ears. His face was almost triangular, built around two huge, almond-shaped eyes. There was a small vertical slit where his nose should have been, and nothing where his mouth should have been. He had no mouth, just three vertical slits. And then there were his eyes. Two of them were where they should have been, although they were a glittery green colour that was kind of shocking. Behind that gentle Andalite expression, I could feel the razor-sharp focus of the powerful, evil Yeerk. Andalites have on their faces, just like the rest of the body, this gentle, almost delicate appearance. So it's not anything frightening. But we definitely do get some consistency with the quotes here, that they have large, almond-shaped eyes. And almonds, it's basically just a knot. It's like, our eyes are almost almond-shaped, so it's not too different. But they are large eyes, larger than ours. They've also got big heads, Andalites. It's mentioned a couple of times that the heads are big. And obviously if a human's saying that, they're talking relatively, means an Andalite has a relatively big head. The face is triangular, there's no mouth, and there is one quote where it says there's one vertical slit, and that's in before the message, where it's talking about Andalite having a single vertical slit. But all other instances say there are three. So on this picture here, we've got one right in the middle, and then most people, Ghost of Essam included, will have two just sort of either side sticking up, sort of heading toward the eyes. It still creates that triangular shape. They're mentioned to have deer-like ears. So what's the deer look like? There you go. So the ears probably look something like this. And also on deers, you have these things called antlers. And this is now important because let's look at the eye stalks. I barely even thought about the fact that an Andalite was standing there, looking like a cross between a blue deer, a mouthless human, a goat with eyes on the ends of his horns, and a scorpion. You know that little horn-like thing giraffes have? Picture those, only flexible, and with an eyeball at the end. The two mobile eyes mounted on antler-like stalks that turned this way and that. A gentle half-deer, half-human-looking creature with bluish fur and an extra set of eyes on comical stalks. There's a few descriptions for these. And one of them describes them like antlers. So we just saw a picture of a deer's antlers. They're quite slender, they curve a bit, and they're quite long. But they also describe them as those things like, several times they describe them as the horns on giraffes, which are actually quite small and stumpy. And they stick straight up in the middle. And then you also get a description of them looking like the horns of a goat. Although that, you could argue that it's described a bit differently there when they bring in the goat description. But I get the feeling that it's like, you get the goat and it's got horns, they sort of come back and then come round like that. Usually. To come forward again. And I think that's what Ghost of Essam's done here, because he's drawn the horns. So eye stalks like quite thick trunk and they come back and forward again. And I've seen a few other people do them like that as well. But you can... There isn't too much consistency here. Are they antler-like? Or are they short and stumpy like giraffe horns? Or are they like goat horns? You know, picture it in your own mind what they look like. But that's what Andalites have. They have eyes on the end of these stalks. And we discussed earlier the colour of Andalite eyes being a glittery green. We never get any other examples of eye colour in Andalites, so we can be largely sure that Andalite eyes are green, like, unless there's a genetic deformity, anomaly somewhere, that Andalite eyes are green, and so by extension you'd assume that the stalk eyes also are green. But that is speculative. Let's now move down the face to the chin to neck area. A smooth blue chin emerged from piercing, sucking mouth parts. He reached out with one thick tentacle and grabbed the Andalite by the neck. Three big Hawk-Bajir grabbed the Andalite and held him down. Their wrist blades were at his throat, but they knew better than to kill him. They're described as having the upper bodies that are similar to humans and human-like heads, so it should come as no great surprise that they have necks and throats. So obviously the airways come through these vertical slits and down there, so they've got necks very similar to us, so they can turn their head this way and that, which they do as you'd expect throughout the series. There's also a chin, which you might say is a bit strange because chins typically associated with jaws, which Andalites must not have because they have no mouths, unless it's a vestigial thing from way back in their evolution. But I doubt it, because whenever they talk about their history or anything else on the planet, they think, mouths are strange things, implying that mouths maybe never evolved in the way that they have here, back on the Andalite home world. But they have chins, so probably just the bottom part of the skull. I think that's just what they're referring to there. Let's move down to the upper body, the upper torso of the Andalite. Let's look at some quotes for that. His upper body looked like a horse's neck and head, except that when he gets close enough, you see that he has two smaller, human-sized arms sticking out. His upper body is like a boy's. He knelt beside the Andalite and placed a comforting hand on the alien's narrow shoulder. A lot of people will draw the Andalites with very human upper bodies, and indeed Kukalis, for example, on the Andalite Chronicles artwork, did a very, very human-like upper torso, but it's not really described like that in the books. And I think what Ghost of Essam does here is he's tried to find the middle ground here. So we talk very small arms with very narrow shoulders, as if they were just sort of stuck on the side of the body. And we also get the descriptions that the upper body is like a horse's neck and head, which is why on this one here, and you'll see it in the little quote cutaways, it's not so much a torso, more like a long extended neck, and it's quite thick around the back of the head. I think that's what Ghost Essam has gone through. You can see it better here actually. It's really thick neck that's just an extension of the torso, as if the whole torso were just an extended neck, and these arms are just sort of stuck onto the sides. But that seems to be the gist of what the books are getting at. Let's quickly look at the arms and fingers while we're on this sort of area of the body. I put my hand inside the glass cage. I had some difficulty grabbing one of the creatures though. Human hands are stronger and faster than Andalite hands. In the end, Cassie grabbed a mosquito and handed it to me. A torso with skinny arms and 7-fingered hands. Andalite arms have their big pros and their big cons. So, as we'll find out later, they're very dexterous. They've got 7 fingers, as described in that quote. And that was quite late in the series as well, that we finally established how many fingers exactly they had. I think it was actually 33 where we got a good indication, and it's 35 where it's specifically stated 7 fingers. But they have these very weak, small arms. So Ghost of Essam has done these quite short arms here. They don't even reach down to, say, the bottom of the lower body here. They are very small, very weak, and so they're also not very fast. So when Axe, for example, has to grab a mosquito, he tries to grab it, but even though his fingers are very dexterous, he just hasn't got the hand strength to move his arm around quick enough. So that's the arms. Let's now move down to the lower body, this bit here. His back slopes down, so that you would never be tempted to think of riding him. She came to me and placed one hand on the back of my neck. She placed another hand on my rump, right at the base of my tail, and suddenly she leaned her weight on me, swung one leg up and over, and came to rest straddling my back. She sat there with one human leg hanging off either side of my back and held her hands clasped around my neck. With one eye shifted to the back, I witnessed the huge, muscular rump grow out of my rusty tail feathers. And although I couldn't see them yet, I could feel 4 strong legs support me, responding to my growing bulk. Muscles! Who would believe the easy strength? I stepped forward, a movement that took almost nothing out of me. We've got a couple of contradictory quotes there. So Rachel in book 7 looks at Axe's back and says, "It's so sloped that you wouldn't even think of sitting on it." And then in the Andalite Chronicles, Lauren's just like, "Yep, it's just like a horsey," and jumps on his back. So I think what Ghost of Essam has done here is you've got the flatter bit down near the rump, and then up here, when you get closer to the upper body, it does start to slope up really quite steeply. So you've got the powerful forelegs here. So you've got all this muscle built up around here, and then of course around the back. And Lauren's able to straddle, and she's only able to hold on by wrapping her arms around his neck, Elfangor's neck. And maybe Rachel saw this and thought, well, if you didn't hang on to the neck, then you'd probably fall backwards off. So it's probably like that. So you can find ways in which it's not inconsistent. And then now let's look down to the legs and the hooves of the Andalite. Each hubcap-sized hoof clomping the dewy ground, sending little clods of soil flying. And last, he stepped out. Dainty Andalite hooves. I found it in the mud. A narrow hoof print, not much different than a deer's. You'd think it was a deer print if you didn't know to look very carefully. It was an Andalite hoof print. This is what Google brings up when you type in deer hoof print. So you've got 2 toes forward facing, and then you've got these bits back here. So if you're not looking carefully, you can mistake an Andalite hoof print for a deer hoof print. So the feet, the hooves of the Andalites must form this sort of shape or something thereabouts. So let's have a look. Ghost of Essam has done something similar here. There is a bit of a contradictory quote, although you could say it's because the first one was looking at Gefinoland's feet, who's supposed to be this massive, bulky, sod-off Andalite. And he's got hubcap-sized hooves. And hubcaps, you know, you're looking at that. You're looking at freaking pan-sized. Whereas Vista 3 is described as having dainty little Andalite hooves. So whether you think they're dainty, like done here, or whether they're these big, like reindeer feet. You ever seen reindeer feet? You got these sort of spindly legs, and they just got sort of. It's like they got spaceships at the end of their feet. That's so they can go on the snow. It's probably somewhere in between, because as we'll find out later, the Andalites eat through their hooves. So maybe they're a bit bigger to accommodate that. I didn't realise we could zoom in actually, so let's now move on. We've done all of that, and now the last bit, and one of the most important for an Andalite, is the tail. The tail makes you think scorpion. It curves up and over, so that the razor-sharp blade tip is usually poised somewhere above his sloping shoulders. As for scorpions, I've only seen pictures. There is some resemblance when it comes to the tail. An Andalite tail is also curved upward and tipped by a very sharp blade. It was thick, powerful, and ended in a wicked scythe blade that literally glittered along its razor-sharp edges. The tail is often depicted as coming up looping over the shoulder like a parrot of the Andalite, which is what Estan's done here. It glitters along the edge, and it's described very much like a scorpion's tail, which, as you know, it curves up and over. Let's now specifically look at the tail blade. The word shorm means tail blade. In his Andalite form, he was a blue-furred centaur with a tail like a chef's knife tied to the end of a bullwhip. This Andalite had a monstrous tail, long and thick, and at its end, a blade that, to my terrified eyes, looked a lot like the scythe thing the Grim Reaper carries. A dangerous foot-long scythe-shaped blade arced forward toward me, at speed no human could hope to evade. I saw his Andalite tail whip and catch gut rip with the blade that was sharper than any Hork-Bajir blade. The tail blade is called the shorm, which, as we'll find out later, is where they get the best friend word from, the best friend thing. So the shorm is often described as scythe-like, like what the Grim Reaper has. You've seen a scythe, surely. It's a long, curved blade, and it's about a foot long, so actually not too long, but you know, it's like machete length. It's also described as something like a chef's knife. So you do get a big variety. Gefinnilan, who's this big bulking monstrosity of an Andalite, his is really curved and like the Grim Reapers, but then Axis is described more like a chef's blade, and he's younger, so obviously as maybe you get bigger Andalites, the blade becomes more curved and longer, but they're typically about a foot long, and they gleam and glitter, so they're made probably of some sort of smooth bone, or maybe, I doubt keratin, I'm pretty sure it would be some sort of bone. But that is the dangerous Andalite tail that makes them so formidable in battle. So we've covered the Andalite's body now. Let's have a look at something the Andalites are also known for, and that is their colour. Where does their colour come from? It comes from their fur and their skin. So let's look at the Andalite fur. The creature had a head and shoulders and arms that were more or less where they should have been, though the skin was a pale shade of blue. But below that he had fur, a mix of blue and tan, covering a four-legged body that really did look like it belonged to a deer, or maybe a small horse. Arms that, except for the blue fur, could pass for those of a middleweight champion. Then, suddenly, his tail snapped and zipped across the blue and tan fur on my chest. I had shaggy blue and tan fur, and a tail weapon of limited utility. What frightened me more, what made it all seem so terribly dangerous, was a small bluish-purple figure standing at the head of this mob. A single Andalite girl. In The Invasion, the first book of the series, the Andalites are described as having fur only on their lower bodies. It says he had pale blue skin, and then he had blue fur covering the lower four legs of the body. But that later changed. From that second quote, it talks about Gefinnilan having blue fur covering his arms. And also we get quotes here and there, I think we saw there, of chest hair being cut, blue and tan chest hair. So it was almost like we retconned that part in The Invasion where it says that Andalites only have fur on the bottom half of their bodies. That seemed to have been retconned. Further on, the Andalites had fur covering all of their bodies, and it was typically blue and tan. Tan is like a sandy brown. But we also get Aldria at one point, who's described as being bluish purple, like she's seen on the cover of the Hork-Bajir Chronicles. But this colour differentiation doesn't appear to be a sexual dimorphic thing, because we see Estrid in the series and she's described as being pale blue in colour. So the Andalite fur tends to be quite shaggy and typically a variation on blue. So you can get pale blue, you get purplish blue, you get blue and tan, but it always seems to stick in that field. I once thought that I'd seen that they were described as being lime coloured before, but that must have been a dream, because I didn't find anything. And if I do find it in the future, I will let you know. But yeah, I think I must have dreamt that bit. But they are typically blue, and with a spattering of tan. But I mentioned sexual dimorphism there. Sexual dimorphism being you've got your males, you've got your females, and there are distinctions between the two, other than just XX and XY. Well, that's humans. But Andalites must have something similar. Let's look at some sexual dimorphism in the Andalites. They were gender differentiated, like Andalites and Hawk-Bajir. There was no mental change. I still had the same Andalite instincts, but now as I walked ahead of Dak, I felt the increased physical power of being in a male form. When I turned my stalk eyes back, I saw the heavy tail blade of a male. I also felt the slight male clumsiness, the lack of subtle balance that a female Andalite possesses. I deliberately moved my fingers down to the blade at his elbow. It was almost as hard as an Andalite male's tail blade, and just as sharp. Females are not born to be warriors. We have smaller tail blades, more like scalpels than the great curved scythes our brothers have. I had injured the monster. I guess no one had even done that before. But it had been a close thing. I hated to admit it, but a big male Andalite warrior could have done it with a single tail strike. It took me 3. Just like in humans, males and females have different strength to their body. So male humans have thicker, denser bones, and you have bigger lung capacity, and they're just better able at fighting, which is why, for example, in boxing you have men's and women's categories, and you want to keep them separate. Andalites, however, have most of their power in their tail, which is reflected in these quotes here. The sexual dimorphism is often centered on the tail. The male tail is stronger, bigger, and the blade as well is described as like a scalpel on a female Andalite, but the big scythe-like blade on males. And for that reason, they are more likely to be in the military. The Andalite military was almost entirely male. You see, I'm not like most females. I'm not content to stay within the sciences and the arts, the traditional female occupations. So the Andalite sexual dimorphism tends to mirror ours in a very similar way. So our militaries are mostly male because that's just the way men are inclined. Typically, they're a bit more like that, and they're a bit more willing to go out and fight, whereas women are more on the creative or how do I put this? The caring side, like most nurses or carers in old people's homes, for example, will be female because they're more naturally inclined to care for those around them, whilst the males will go out and punch a gazelle. You know, that's how we evolved. That's how we came to be, and you can't just get rid of that. Although some people probably want to. But alas, like us humans, the Andalites are bound to biology, and you cannot just simply stop being a biological specimen. So the Andalites, in much the same way in humans, are inclined to go one way or the other, depending on the sex that they are. So females look like they often go that way, but Aldria is the anomaly, and she says, actually, I want to go be a warrior. And she does eventually. Well done. Although, of course, throughout that book, she just spends most of the time manipulating Dak, manipulating her boyfriend. So there is the sexual dimorphism in the Andalites, but that's about the limit we get of it so far. Let's look a bit deeper. Let's look at the molecular side of Andalites. You will only need to touch a creature to acquire its DNA pattern, and you will be able to become that creature. He tried to raise his own Andalite tail. He tried to bring the blade to his throat, but the venom had weakened him. His tail fell limp. I mentioned this in the Hawk-Bajir video because the Hawk-Bajir was bitten by a snake in, I forget which book, I think it was 14, and fell victim to the toxin, the venom. And in order for that to happen, you need to have certain molecular structures going on. That would be similar to things you see on Earth. For example, DNA. And Andalites have DNA. That's... Why do you keep switching? Andalites must have DNA because that's how morphing works, and morphing is an Andalite technology, so 1 + 1 = 2. So Andalites have DNA much in the same way that we do, basically self-replicating molecules that form the structure of the body. Let's look at Andalite blood. There isn't much in terms of Andalite blood, and we get one quote that indicates the potential colour of Andalite blood? Let's look at these quotes now. These are what the flea used to pierce my skin and drink my blood. Why a flea should have a taste for Andalite blood is a mystery. A line of blue-black blood appeared. The blood must be quite similar to Earth creatures' blood because the flea is attracted to it and tries to suck Axe's blood, so there must be similar components to this blood. However, the only time we get into, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the only time we ever get an indication of what colour Andalite blood is from the sickness, when Cassie's going through his brain and a line of blue-black blood appears. So if that were consistent throughout the Andalite body, then the blood would be blue-black, which sort of makes sense because the skin is said to be blue. And what do you know about the skin? The colour is sort of a result of the blood that's flowing beneath it. Not entirely, but because obviously our blood is red, and I'm not red, but there is a red tint to the human body, and that is from blood. So why would an Andalite's skin be blue? Possibly because of the dark blue blood that they carry. What is a yamfoot? Good question, you might ask. Okay, Axe, try and focus. Tell us what yamfoot is, I said, speaking slowly and clearly. Disease, Axe answered. Disease organisms collecting in my tree gland. Andalites are affected by certain diseases, which is unfortunate for them. What seems to be more unfortunate is how the body combats disease. What is the one area you would not like the disease to be near? Okay, you can probably say there's a couple, so the heart would be a big contender, but I would say any organ in the body that I do not specifically want my diseases to be collected near is probably the brain. Unfortunately for Andalites, their evolution has said, you know where we're going to collect the diseases and whatever have you? Let's do it in the brain. At least that's the impression I'm getting. I could be wrong. Let's look at the quotes about the tree gland. Tell us more about the tree gland, I said. Tree gland keeps disease organisms away from the rest of the body, Axe answered. That's good, right? Tobias asked. It sounded good. Maybe Axe's body would heal itself. But if it bursts, bad. Disease organisms get loose, Axe choked out. The tree gland is in the back of the head, Aftran explained. It's even with the bottom of his ears, dead centre. The gland is about as big as a human thumb. Well, Karen's thumb, at least. Yeah, I was right. So the tree gland keeps all the diseases in it. It holds all these diseases away from the rest of the body. And it's right by the brain. And there's a chance it might explode. Stupid, stupid, stupid. I don't like Book 29. People like Book 29, but it's just so fundamentally flawed in a few ways, and yeah. But apparently, yes, the Andalites have something called a tree gland, which collects all of these diseases and just holds them by the brain, ready to explode. And it's not as if Axe was an aged Andalite, you know? He's had a whole lifetime to build up all these diseases. No, he was quite young, and suddenly the tree gland's just like, nah, I give up. And sod this. My God. And Cassie has to remove the tree gland. So what does that mean? Does Axe now like unable to fight diseases? What a stupid organ. Seriously, if the tree gland is what holds diseases away from the rest of the body, then what happens once it's removed? We never get an explanation. Does it grow back once he's more? It's just so stupid. Book 29 was such a letdown. But let's now move on to other organs. Let's talk about hearts. How many hearts does an Andalite have? There was a scary little jolt as my second and third hearts stopped beating. Both my hearts sank into my hooves. I left the barn and galloped until both my hearts were pounding. One Andalite heart disappeared into Z-space. The other reformed to a human heart and began its distinctive beat. I felt two faint blips as my hearts stopped beating, absorbed into the pounding heart of the chimp. A lot of Animorph stuff out there, including Xenophobia, says that Andalites have 3 hearts. And if you were to have just read Book 8, The Alien, you'd think that was absolutely true. But one thing about Book 8, The Alien, is that everything about it was later retconned. It might as well not be a book in the series anymore, because everything in that just got chucked out eventually. Including this. Because every subsequent time Andalite hearts are mentioned, it mentions 2 hearts. And not just both hearts, which it does, but it mentions specifically, one of my hearts did that, and the other heart did that. And it does that several times, indicating to me that Andalites have 2 hearts, not 3. Another retcon from Book 8, The Alien, adding to the growing list. So yes, Andalites indeed have 2 hearts rather than 3. What about lungs? I could literally see my own lungs collapsing inside me. Most animals with lungs have mucus, Axe said loudly. Andalites have it too. We don't get a number of lungs, but we know that it's plural. That's as much as we know, really. Also that it contains mucus. So Andalites probably sneeze and have snot. So by chew, you're going to get some stuff all over your shirt. Just so you know. Because, what will probably happen is the mucus takes all these diseases and holds them and then sinks them. They ingest this mucus like we do, and then those diseases probably get sent back up to the tree gland to hang out by the brain. Speaking of the brain, we've now circled back around. What's the Andalite brain like? I saw the Yeerk slug. It was wrapped around Alaran's brain, sinking into every wrinkle and crevice, sinking deep between the 4 segments. Just like our brains, they're these wrinkled things, and there are 4 segments to this brain, so you could argue that humans have 2 segments, so you've got your left and your right, but you could also argue that we have more segments than that, so you've got like the hypothalamus, you've got the cerebral cortex, you've got the occipital cortex, you've got all these different bits, but I'm speculating that it means 4 segments. So like we've got left and right, they've got left front, left back, right back. I'm assuming that's what it's trying to say, like it's got 4 distinct blocks to it. I'm thinking that's what it's saying. And all these organs in this Andalite, it's encased in, just like us, bone. I could feel the metal blade scraping the bone of Axe's skull. I could hear my bones dissolving. I could feel sickening lurches as my internal organs all disappeared. My complex Andalite hearts became something that was barely a valve. And there we have it. There's the insides of the Andalite. So they have a skull like us, they've got bones, and we got a last bit there, a little bit more on the hearts. But that is the internal organs covered. So what do organs do? Well, some of them, like eyes and tongues, maybe not tongues in Andalite, in this case of the Andalites, they have senses. They sense the world around them. Like the sense of smell, the sense of hearing, the eyesight, the taste. What senses do Andalites have and what are their capabilities? Let's first look at the sense of sight. It's impossible to sneak up on an Andalite. My stalk eyes are capable of seeing a little further into the ultraviolet and infrared spectra of light. These are excellent eyes, Axe said. Far better than your human eyes, even better than my Andalite eyes. Andalites have very good vision, as we saw with those quotes. And because they've got the mounted stalk eyes, it's impossible to sneak up on an Andalite, even though many times throughout the series people sneak up on an Andalite. Usually Visser 3, but not just Visser 3. It's just another series contradiction. But if an Andalite's alert, you're not going to be able to sneak up on it, because it's constantly looking around and it's got very good eyesight, even better than human eyesight, as Axe stated there. But not only that, but they have a broader range in the stalk eyes, so the stalk eyes can see more into the infrared and ultraviolet areas of the spectrum, so they'll be able to see colours unlike we see those colours, and probably pick out predators, or what would historically be predators, better than we could. So on a scale of 1 to 10, if human vision is 6, then Andalite vision is probably 6.5 or 7. So it's not too much better, but noticeably better. What about taste? Because we'll discuss later on how Andalites feed, but before we do that, do they actually have a sense of taste? Andalites have no mouths and no sense of taste. So whenever Axe played human, he found the sense of taste extremely exciting. He would try to eat everything around him. Andalites have only a vestigial sense of taste. Nothing like the explosive sensory overload from the human mouth. We get a slight contradiction here. It's not too much though, but Rachel will say that Andalites have no sense of taste, but we could be talking relatively. So if humans have an 8 out of 10 on the sense of taste, it's probably actually closer to 10, honestly. I mean, have you ever tried hot dogs? But Andalites are probably like a 1. So it's not a complete 0. But Axe says that I think it was Axe, says they have a vestigial. What does vestigial mean? Well, if you ever looked at evolutionary biology, vestigial means something that was once present but is now in a drastically diminished or altered state. So the legs of whales, for example, they have little bones that are vestigial, meaning that they don't have the purpose they once did and they're vastly diminished. They still have a purpose, but it's not what it used to be. Or for example, claws on a python. Yes, there are claws on a python, and they are vestigial. So what that tells me is that maybe Andalites had a sense of taste that was stronger in the past, but that doesn't really make sense to me. But then again, it's an alien race, so doesn't necessarily need to make sense to me at this moment in time. But it's described as a vestigial sense of taste. There is still a slight bit of taste there. Okay, imagine whenever you've had a cold, like a severe cold or the flu, and you feel like you've lost your sense of taste. You know that feeling. Maybe it's like that, where you haven't totally lost your sense of taste. There is still something there, but it's nothing the same as when you're actually able to taste things. I think you probably most of you out there have probably had that sensation of not being able to taste something because of having a cold or flu. I imagine it's something like that, where there is still something there, you can tell, but it's not in your face. What about other senses? Well, we don't really hear much about the hearing or the sense of smell of an Andalite, but they've got a couple of other senses that we don't have. Andalites have the ability to keep track of time naturally, like some kind of internal clock. Can you tell which direction the ship is flying right now? Jake asked. The ship is still heading north, Prince Jake. They have 2 innate senses inbuilt into them. That's what we can assume. We can definitely assume the first, which is the natural timekeeping, because Axe is used as the team's stopwatch in pretty much every mission they're on. He's able to pretty much perfectly count time, and it's an amazing ability. I wish I had it, but unfortunately I do not. But they are able to, maybe it's something to do with the position of the sun. That might also explain why they're able to have this inbuilt compass, as we discover in book 25, or at least it's not as clear, because you can't. Maybe he's just very good at remembering which direction they thought they were travelling in, but there is a strong implication that they're in this enclosed space and Axe still just knows which direction they're heading. They're heading north, because Jake has to ask him, where do you think we're going? Axe says, finger to the wind, Reading north, even though there's no wind. So those are 2 innate Andalite senses that we can be largely sure that they have. Definitely the first one, the timekeeping. Probably the second, having an inbuilt compass. Birds have it, for example. I think they do. You know, birds will fly south for the winter. How do they know where south is? They just freaking know. Probably the same thing with Andalites. Coming towards the end of biology now, let's look at the life cycles of the Andalites. Well, much like us humans and lots of many, basically earth mammals and many other creatures, it is a male and female, a mother and a father, providing offspring. In my quarters I have holograms of my father and mother, of course, plus a wish flower representing the little brother I'll be getting in a few years. So you have a mother and a father, and they come together and produce offspring, just like us humans. Now, this isn't particularly clear. Maybe Elfangor's parents had said to him, in a few years we're going to have another one of you. Or she, the mother, is pregnant and it's going to take a few years for that child to develop, which isn't necessarily unheard of. You know, on Earth we have different gestation periods. So maybe it takes a few years for an Andalite to be born. But that doesn't really take into consideration how long an Andalite year is. We will move on to that in a second. If I live 200 years, I'll probably still be known as Elfangor's little brother. Prince Cyril, yes. He was my first prince. Did you know that? Many centuries ago, when I was an arist like you. Axe considers living 200 years. Lyram, from Book 8, says many centuries ago, Elfangor was my first prince. So we can be pretty certain that Andalites live hundreds of years. Possibly 200 or 300, maybe more. Let's look at years, shall we? This seems an appropriate time to do some maths. And I've been doing that. So we get a few numbers thrown at us, not very many, and so we can't narrow it down perfectly, but I think I've come up with a solution. So Axe talked about living 200 years, as if that were a long time for an Andalite. Okay, so we've got that. We've also got Lyram saying that he was Elfangor's arist many centuries ago. And there seems to be a contradiction here. But if we consider that perhaps Axe was talking in human years and Lyram in Andalite years, then perhaps we could be onto something. And in the Hobbies Chronicles, we get some dates. Andalite date, year 8561.2. Earth date, 1966. Andalite date, year 8563.5. Earth date, 1968. We also have a number from Axe saying how long he's been marooned on planet Earth in Book 18, The Decision. I have been marooned on Earth for approximately 0.7 standard Andalite years. So the Andalite years seem to be measured differently to ours, so our years are in 12 months, whereas the Andalites seem to say the year is 3.4, and usually that would imply out of 10, so it goes 0.1 up to 0.9 and then starts on the next year. Now we've got the two dates from the Hobbies Chronicles, and they are 2.3 apart, so we can say that 2.3 Andalite years has passed from chapter 1 to chapter 2 in the Hobbies Chronicles. This is where the range comes in, because for Earth date we don't get anything specific, we get 2 years, which is anywhere from 13 months to 35 months, because 66 to 68, is that right? Yeah, so if you're in December 66 and January 68, that's about 13 months apart. So you're between 35 months and 13 months, which is quite a large gap, I will say. So I did both. And so if you take the Andalite year number of years 2.3 to be equal to 35 months in human time, that means that every Andalite year is equivalent to 1.27 human years. If you went for the minimum and say that 2.3 Andalite years was the same as 13 months, that would mean that every Andalite year is equal to 0.47 human years. If we go back to Axe's number saying he's been stranded on Earth for 0.7 years, that means the time range from book 1 to book 18 is somewhere between 11 and 4 months, or 4 and 11 months. So that's actually, the first 18 books are actually crammed in. It's not like one a month. It's actually within a much shorter period of time. We can now look at what we saw earlier, where Axe says, oh, I could live up to 200 years, and Lyram saying, I've lived for centuries. If we put these into a calculation and just times it by 400, I've said, So I'm just arbitrarily saying maybe Lyram lived to 400 Andalite years. In human years, if we go by the maximum of 35 months, that equals 508. So 400 Andalite years is equal to 508 human years, which I don't think is accurate. What I think is more accurate is if we take the 13 months and we times that by 100, equals 188 years, which is close to 200. So 188 Earth years is equivalent to about 400 Andalite years, which would then match up Axe saying, oh, I've lived a long time, and Lyram saying, I've lived for many centuries. That makes them sort of fit. So what I'm thinking there is Axe is talking in human years when he's saying I could live for 200 years, and Lyram was talking purely in Andalite years, and that's taken into consideration that 1 Andalite year is equivalent to 0.47 human years, which is the minimum number we took from those Hawkbajir Chronicles numbers. Okay? That's a lot of calculating there, and I hope you followed along, but I've put up the picture, the image on screen, so that you can see what my calculations have been doing. But that is what I'm going to have as my headcanon now, that a human, an Andalite year is, or 0.7 human years is equal to 1 Andalite year, which would actually mean that the space from book 1 to book 18 is about 4 months, so it's really crammed in there. Not completely illogical, because if you look at the first few books, they can all sort of fit into a month, like quite easily. Then as the series goes on, it probably spreads out further and covers eventually 3 years. But that's what I think. You could think otherwise, but that's just what I'm saying. That's what I'm speculating. That's what my maths shows, and I've given a range. It can fall anywhere within that range. But what happens to an Andalite when he ages? Well, for humans, you know, your head goes missing and you start to get... What do Andalites do when they age? He's going bald, Cassie said. It's probably better not to mention it. It's a normal thing for humans, but some people get sensitive about it. Ah yes, my father's hooves are getting dull. It's normal as well, but he doesn't like to talk about it. The old warrior laughed at his own wit, turned away and went galloping off across the grass, holding his tail as high as an Andalite half his age would. He was an older Andalite. Much of his blue fur was tanned. So when Andalites get older, their fur goes more from blue to tan, sort of like how our hair tends to go grey or white. So again, very, very similar to how humans work, and their hooves grow dull in very much the same way, that the colour starts to fade. And when they're running, their tail goes, you know, maybe they don't have the strength to hold their tail as high anymore, and their tail just sort of gradually droops down as they get older. But that's all we really know about Andalite aging. Let's now cover some miscellaneous biology to finish off this overarching segment of the Andalite analysis. Let's look at some random points. We don't know what normal Andalite temperature is. Axe, can you tell us? Rachel asked him. 91.3, Axe gasped. Of your degrees, he added. 91.3 degrees Fahrenheit is apparently the normal Andalite body temperature, which does imply that they are warm-blooded creatures, assuming they use the same systems as we do down here. So you've got warm-blooded and cold-blooded. Cold-blooded, they maintain their temperature through their surroundings. Warm-blooded, they maintain their temperature internally. By consuming lots of food, they're able to control their own body temperature, which is apparently what Andalites do. The human body temperature in Fahrenheit is 98.6. Obviously, I'd use Celsius because I'm freaking normal, but because I'm talking mostly to Americans, I've got to use freaking Fahrenheit. 98.6. Celsius is easy. Water freezes at 0, boils at 100. Rank everything based on that. Excellent. You don't have to deal with freaking all these silly numbers. Just freaking get it right, America. Jesus Christ. You just have to be different, don't you? You just have to invent basketball and American football. We use Fahrenheit. Just freaking get with the times, guys. You're just like the edgy cousin who just has to be different at everything, aren't you? You just have to be different. You can't just like something that other people like. You got to be... You're basically David America. The weird kid who's, you know, just... He owns a Cobra and listens to Megadeth. Why? Because he's the edgy one. He just wants to be different. America is David. I'm calling it. But whatever. This does mean that Andalite core body temperature is actually cooler than ours. Isn't that fun to know? It's miscellaneous information, of course. Next one. His skin felt cold and slick with perspiration. Andalites sweat. Another fantastic fact. And moving on to the next one, it's actually linked, because what does sweat do? It doesn't tend to... It smells of body odour, basically. Do Andalites smell at all? Have I mentioned that I hate this morph? Tobias added. I mean, I'm finding myself very attracted to the viscous sweat. How sick is that? Yeah, Cassie agreed. He stinks. But to my fly brain, he actually smells kind of good. He certainly does not stink, Axe said defensively. This is an Andalite body, and Andalites have never been known to stink. So who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe the Animorphs in Flymorph, or are you going to believe Axe, who's obviously biased, you know? Do Andalites smell? Well, they produce sweat, which, you know, it's body odour and, you know... Do Andalites smell? It's entirely speculative, hence why it's in Miscellaneous Biology in this little throwaway segment somewhere in the middle. Now's the time for you to go get yourself a drink, because we're going to move on to the next large segment now. We've covered the Andalite biology, you know, the way the body looks, the way it moves, the senses, how long it lives, and that sort of stuff. We're now going to move outwards. We're going to look external. We're going to look at Andalite ecology. So, ecology. What is ecology? It is how on Earth, a species would interact with its environment. What is the Andalite environment? Where do they tend to hang out, as it were? Andalites never take shelter unless they must. In the depth of a cold night, or to avoid harsh weather, or to fend off an attack, or when they must serve aboard spacecraft. Andalites are creatures of the open spaces. They hate being confined in any way. They become nervous and afraid if they don't have large areas in which to run. An Andalite sought instinctively for the vast expanses of open grass, the delicate pastoral trees, the meandering rivers and streams. The bridges were narrow, infrequent, usually crowded, and fairly terrifying to Andalites who were not at all used to heights. I like your planet from what I've seen of it, Lauren said. It's like Earth, only without the houses and buildings. Andalites live in apparently open grasslands with plenty of open space, a spattering of trees, and if it's anything like Lincolnshire, it's just flat. So Andalites from the Hobbies Chronicles aren't very good with heights, so they're probably not hanging around cliffs or big mountainsides or anything like that, and they did struggle on the Hobbies homeworld just going up and down the slopes. So the Andalite environment is typically flat, open grasslands. That's what we can get from this. Where do they actually live? Well, they live in things called scoops. They had dug into the valley wall. It was not deep, but they had covered the scooped area with a cloth that hung in the air. If I were at home, I would still be a cadet in the Andalite Military Academy. I would spend most of my time in my parents' scoop. For the purpose of this video, we'll just say that scoops are basically Andalite dwellings. They're carvings in the side of walls, or they're just holes in the ground that are covered with a sheet. Andalites will stay in the scoop as a family unit. Axe said that he would be there as a cadet in the academy, so very much like humans, you get to a certain age and that's when you start to, fly the nest. But it would appear to be very similar in that once they get through adolescence, then they might consider moving out. That seems to be the case here. But again, we got no detail, and we will cover scoops in more detail in a future analysis. So let's move on now. So what sort of things would an Andalite do in a scoop? It would seem primarily it's a place for them to rest, to sleep. What is Andalite sleep like? Sleep isn't always that easy for me. For most Andalites, we are a watchful species. My mother explained it to me once when I found myself unable to sleep for several days. I found a quiet place and prepared to sleep. I closed my main eyes, leaving only my stalk eyes open to look for danger. I relaxed my tail until it touched the ground. "Aldria, wake up!" Aldria's eyes snapped open, all four of them. The stalk eyes slowly turned to look upward. Because Andalites are historically a prey species, then they're quite watchful when they're sleeping. There are a couple of, are they contradictory quotes? Because in one of them, it says that Axe goes to sleep, he closes his main eyes, but his stalk eyes remain open and focused and looking around as he sleeps. But then in the Hobbies Chronicles, Aldria is woken up and she opens all four eyes as if those two stalk eyes are also closed during the process of sleep. Maybe it's just while they're about to go to sleep, the stalk eyes remain open until a point where they eventually decide, okay, it's fine to sleep, and they close. That would seem like the simple solution there. But we're not given any idea of whether they sleep on their side, whether they sleep sort of on their haunches with their upper bodies up. We don't get shown that at all, so we don't know about Andalite sleep more than that. So let's move on. Outside of the scoop, what would they likely be doing? They would likely be eating, feeding, taking nutrients from the grass, because they tend to eat grass. Let's go into the details about Andalite feeding. How do you eat without a mouth? Marco demanded. I laughed. We eat as we run. Our hooves crush the grass, and the nutrients are absorbed into our systems. We drink in the same way, by putting a hoof into water. Andalites eat by absorbing plants through their hollow hooves. I ate by running, by crushing grasses within my hollow hooves and digesting bulk and nutrients. We talked about the deer hoof earlier and the shape of that. So apparently they are hollow, whether that means that you've got the two hoof bits there and there's a gap between those, or whether the actual hooves have two hollow gaps in them. I'm suspecting the former. So like maybe the two toenails or hoof sections crush the grass and crush it inwards, and it comes into this hollow leg. Now initially it says that they absorb nutrients as if, you know, they just take molecular stuff, like it gets stuck into their hooves, and it very much like a plant root will absorb water. Okay, it doesn't just take big gulps of water, it absorbs the molecules. Okay, but in one of those quotes it talks about digesting bulk. Now forgive me if I'm wrong, but the indication here is almost that the hooves are hollow to a degree, and that consider that the hoof is like a mouth. So you've got the opening and then you've got a cavity, and maybe the hooves pick up stuff and it goes in there and sits in there for a while absorbing stuff, and then maybe stuff gets spat back out, which is an unusual physiology and one that we're not given too much indication of or too much description of. Let's move on a bit further to get a little bit more information before we come to a final conclusion. One of the contentions about Andalite hooves is, are they always sucking, or can they be closed off? Can they stop eating, or are they always eating no matter what their hoof is in? I know just a little about Andalites' physiology. See, they eat and drink through their hooves. Right now, the viscera was absorbing the water of the Yeerk pool. Wait, what? I was drinking. I looked at my hoof. It looked normal, but the thirst in my legs was being quenched. It was amazing. It was also a little creepy. I closed my hooves to the sparse Yeerk vegetation. I didn't trust those dark red plants. We have contradictions here. So Andalite's talking about, oh, I know enough about Andalite physiology to know that while Viscera 3 is in the Yeerk pool, he's absorbing the water that the oatmeal has gone in. We also have in the illusion, Tobias being an Andalite, he sticks his hoof in and automatically feels himself drinking, as if he's not been in control of the action. And then in the Andalite Chronicles, which to be fair is the Andalite Chronicles, and you can hardly consider that canon in a lot of cases, Elfangor talks about closing his hooves to Yeerk plants. So what conclusion can we take from this? It's almost as if they automatically, the default is that they are absorbing what they're in contact with, but the Andalite can say, no, I don't want to absorb anymore, and it stops it. That would appear to be the case here, which means that Rachel is wrong. Saying, oh, Visser 3's in the Yeerk pool water with the oatmeal, therefore he's absorbing it as we speak. Well, not if Visser 3 can just decide, I'm not going to drink this anymore, and close off his hooves. That would appear to be the case. There's still a contradiction in there. So that, again, comes down to our speculation. Are they always drinking? You know, if you threw an Andalite into a swimming pool, is it just going to be like a sponge? They're just going to keep drinking till they explode or something? Or well, are they able to stop it, like Elfangor in the Andalite Chronicles? I would probably go with the latter. They probably have a way to stop that from happening. Else, I don't know. But then again, if you're just absorbing nutrients, then you're not going to get the whole water coming in. You're just going to get like bits coming out. I don't know how it freaking works. Let's go over a couple of extra bits. So this bit is interesting. I had seen Lauren eat aboard the Jahar, of course. She and the other human had eaten emergency rations of liquefied grass. The rations we give Andalites who are too sick or injured to stand up and eat normally. So sick Andalites who are not able to stand have to drink liquefied grass. Now, this is a bit weird because I don't know how this works, because if they just absorb grass through their hooves, then surely just put their... Oh, it sort of does make sense, really. So, if you're just going to put their hoof into a box filled with grass and you're not crushing anything, you're not going to get any moisture out of the grass, or you're not going to liquefy it by standing on it. Whereas if, you know, it's a liquid, then maybe it gets into all, like, the nooks and crannies of the hoof, the hollow part of the hoof, and it gets sucked up that way. So maybe this is how it works. Basically, Andalites only drink. So when it comes to food bulk, they crush it down to an almost liquid form by standing on it, and it gets sucked into this hoof and crushed down, and then the moisture is basically absorbed into the body. That would seem to be a reasonable conclusion to come to. And let's add it to this last quote about Andalite feeding. The fact that there are Andalite toilets. Well, this is a bit embarrassing. It's an Andalite dome ship's modular waste disposal system. Marco spoke. You're telling me the most secret place on Earth, the fabled Zone 91, the holy grail of conspiracy knots, is hiding the secret of an Andalite toilet? Only a very primitive model, Axe said condescendingly. Andalites have toilets, which means that they have waste disposal systems going on, which means that there is an intake of more than just essential molecules of things like growth. Because when we eat, you know, we take in large items that come pre-packaged with all sorts of stuff. So you got your essential stuff that is good for growing, for replacing blood cells, for in terms of water, keeping the necessary molecular systems going in the body, you know, oxygen and stuff like that, keeps it all flowing nicely. And then as a side package to all of it, you get stuff that can't be digested or goes into the gets converted to urea and stuff like that, and that all gets eventually flushed away. Okay, so Andalites obviously have the same sort of thing. So they take in stuff that eventually is put back out of the body, and not in the way because they breathe. They've got lungs, so that waste goes out that way, as in carbon dioxide goes back out that way. So there's got to be something in the food or drink product that they absorb that eventually comes back out again, hence the need for a waste disposal system on the Andalite dome ships. Who knows what that is? We have no information. But I suspect that if these creatures crush things down to moisture and absorb it that way, then maybe that's all that comes out is moisture. If you get what I'm saying. That would require a modular waste disposal system. But I'm not going to go any further into this because it just paves the way for toilet humour, doesn't it? You can speculate that all you want. I'm going to move on. And I'm going to move on to the general physical capabilities of Andalites. So let's take a look first off at the speed of these creatures, the motility of Andalites. Andalites have 4 legs. This gives us the speed of horses. My hooves flashed. My tail was tucked down tight against my back for speed. The Vis's Andalite body was fast, but it was not faster than the snake. I knew that from my own experience. They've got 4 legs, therefore they're fast as horses, which is not a very sensible logical jump, but it turns out to be sort of correct. They are very fast. They are built like horses or deer, which do move at great speeds. So that is true. And an interesting fact there, that they hold their tails back, that they press it down against their back to increase their aerodynamics, allowing them to move faster. But in terms of speed at a standstill, they aren't as fast as snakes. Just so you know, they aren't as fast as snakes. So a snake will get in there quicker than an Andalite is able to react. That's a power levels thing. And we're going to go more into that a bit later on when we talk about Andalite fighting. But for now, let's look more at other motility factors for the Andalites. Firstly, how high can an Andalite jump? I've seen humans jump. They cannot jump their own height. Even we Andalites can barely jump our own height. They can barely jump their own height. So yeah, let's call that they basically jump their own height, which, considering they're probably about as tall as humans, about 6 feet off the ground, that's quite, it's not massive. But it's a considerable amount that they can jump. And they can also jump backwards over pools, which I believe happened in the Threat, Book 21, where he jumped backwards, Axe jumped backwards over a pool. So they're very capable jumpers. They're also very capable with their dexterity. So let's talk about the precision, the ability to manipulate with their fingers. Let's talk about that. Axe went to work on the Helmicron ship. I watched for a while. He used some of the surgical equipment Cassie's dad kept in the barn, held the precise instruments in his delicate Andalite fingers, and carefully manipulated control rods the size of human hairs. Think about that, although do remember that this is in book 42, The Journey, which was a catastrophe of a book, so take it for what you will. But Axe is sitting there with a Helmicron ship, and with a couple of Cassie's father's tools, he's able to get in there. Human hair, and consider, I know my hair is particularly thin. Just don't say anything, Medi. But he's able to manipulate control panels with instruments that size using these tools. So incredibly precise. Because if you try that, if I try that and you try that, there's enough shake in the human hand that would be it would be very, very difficult to do. But Axe is just there like, bing. He's having a great time with it. But unfortunately for Andalite arms, they're just, yeah, they may be precise and dexterous and all that, but they're just not as powerful as, say, the Andalite tail. Axe missed the catch. Andalite hands are weak and slow, but before the box could hit the ground, Axe whipped his tail forward, turned the blade flat and caught the box. He raised the box to his hands. So where an Andalite's arms fail, the tail comes in handy. Ironic. Is that irony? I don't know. But whatever, the tail comes into the rescue, and it always comes down to the tail with the Andalites. It is like the most important item on these particular creatures, apart from, like, I don't know, the brain. But this thing comes in, they're able to manipulate it, do all this crazy, wacky ninja stuff with their tail. And let's look at a few more things that this tail is capable of. He moved briskly to the manhole cover, stuck the tip of his tail blade in the small hole intended for the crowbar, and, with one swift, fluid twist of his tail, sent the 50-pound steel cap tumbling through the air. It landed with dull resonance inches from Jake's feet. For human readers, I should explain that my own Andalite body is of course sufficient for battle situations. I have 4 eyes, 4 legs, 2 arms, and a tail blade that can slice a human in half with 1 swipe. Well, perhaps 2 swipes. I may perhaps have a tendency to overstate my capabilities. A rather gruesome way for Axe to describe the power of his tail, but this thing is able to launch manhole covers to within an inch of taking out Jake's shins, and then Axe says, "Oh, I can slice you in half. Pfft, not a problem, mate." And this brings us neatly onto the fighting capabilities of the Andalites. So in a fight, they are pretty formidable. And it mostly comes from, of course, the tail. His tail whipped up and over, so fast you couldn't really see it. In a movement too fast for me to see, Axe whipped his tail forward. In the blink of an eye, his scythe blade was levelled a 1/4 inch from my throat. This, combined with the eyes being able to move in a 360 window for an Andalite, makes them incredibly difficult to beat. But there is one weakness for an Andalite. Axe, what's the best way to sneak up on an Andalite? From beneath. Unless you're Visa 3, of course, in which case you just have to be slightly distracted by something and then you can be snuck up on. But in general, Andalites can only really be attacked from beneath because their main eyes are looking out left to right, the stalk eyes can be looking up, back, sideways, but never straight down below. Or at least they wouldn't necessarily do that unless they had an absolute desire to. So that's the only way they can be snuck up on. Which means that they are very powerful in a fight. And now let's look at some examples where we look at the power levels. As if we were in Dragon Ball Z, you know, who would win in a fight against who. Let's pit the Andalites against a variety of other creatures and see how they fare. "I will teach you something," Axe said, backing up. "A move I rely on frequently. The Torf. You begin a common strike and then, millimeters before impact, twist your blade to the side, so that only the flat of the blade connects with the target. It won't do much to a Hork-Bajir, but it will knock a human unconscious. We will use this trunk as a target. An Andalite can almost always beat 1 Hork-Bajir, usually 2. 1 Andalite is not a match for 3 Hork-Bajir." The Skritnar decided to make it easy. I guess they had figured they had made us mad enough. Skritnar are no match for Andalite power. Creatures like Skritnar or humans are generally not a problem for the Andalites, so the purpose of that first quote was just to show that, you know, an Andalite is not actually going to need to physically kill a human, it's just knock them out and you're done. It makes it look very, very easy, so, and the Skritnar won't even try to put up a fight against an Andalite. But then you come to Hork-Bajir and you'd say 2.5 Hork-Bajir is equal to 1 Andalite in terms of fighting capability. So an Andalite is easily able to take care of 1 Hork-Bajir, usually 2, but 3 is basically the limit. That's how far you go unless you get a really strong warrior to get in there. That is roughly where we are. Of course you could say, what about Taxxons? Well, Taxxons are basically wet paper bags, so don't even need to talk about it really. But the thing is, we talk about Andalite warriors and they have a long history of being warriors. But they don't really fight amongst themselves, at least not anymore. The Andalites are an essentially peaceful race, but with a long warrior tradition too. It had been a very long time since any Andalites fought tail to tail, except as part of military training or as a sport. Now later on we're going to talk about the politics and the demeanour and the culture of the Andalites, and we'll discuss this more, that they've got this warrior tradition. But they don't actually fight unless it's against other races, and when they do so, it tends to be within the confines of spaceships, so long distance stuff. So for a creature that's so reliant on its tail blade, it doesn't even really use it. And that is an interesting concept really, isn't it? It's you can ask a lot of questions, you could talk a lot about that, but we're not going to do that here. That's perhaps for an Annie theory another day. Let's now look at Andalite communication. "Hello," the alien said, in that silent way that you only heard inside your head. The Andalites have no mouths and no spoken speech. Axe seemed to think mouths were some kind of toy. Andalites communicate using thought speak. We've done a thought speak analysis before, so perhaps at some point you want to go see that to get more information on how this works. I'm not going to go into the full detail here. But thought speak is effectively telepathy. You're speaking through your mind to other people's minds. And we do eventually go into some history of how this works, how it started off as an emotional thing, almost a hormonal thing. Like an Andalite had an emotional state, it sent off hormones, and another person was able to read those hormones and basically see what the other Andalite was thinking through that. And it's almost like it evolved from that. But there is another way that the Andalites communicate other than thought speak. Apparently they do have a written language. Jake sighed. So, the night the Andalite landed, when I went inside his ship to get the cube that gave us our morphing powers, I saw writing. I could be wrong, I mean, I'm not some expert, Jake said, but I think it was that same alphabet, those same kinds of letters. I told him where to look, and he described what I'd known he would see. The wood where the bark had been scraped away was cut with symbolic branches entwined. A bit of Hork-Bajir graffiti, a love letter. The Hork-Bajir symbol for undying love, Toby told the others. It sounds as if it contains the Andalite letters A and D as well. So we have plenty of evidence that they have an alphabet, a form of written language, written communication, much like we do. So Toby says there's the Andalite symbols for A and D, so they have equivalents to our typical... Because what is the alphabet? A is just a mouth sound, a specific mouth sound. K, that's a mouth sound. E, ah, oo, ah, e, oo. They can all be associated with a letter. So make any mouth sound you want, as long as it's like basically monosyllabic. So, wah is wah. That's a W. And then we've got a symbol for that sound that our mouths make. That's how language works. And I know that Andalites don't have the mouth, they don't have the spoken sound, which is what makes this a bit weird, because effectively written language is taking the thing that your mouth does and put it on paper. So it's weird how Andalites do that, unless they associate it with certain hormones that they send off that creates this thought speak. It's very unusual and very sci-fi, but maybe that's how it is. Maybe over the years they've learnt to channel emotional things into some sort of almost spoken language, and then they associated each syllable of this emotional language and made it into letters, and that's what we see there. Perhaps that's what it is, and that's actually a really fun sci-fi thing, isn't it? I like that, and I think I'll do an Annie theory on that someday. Sounds fun, doesn't it? But anyway, let's move on from that to facial expressions. Andalites do, of course, have facial expressions. The alien seemed to smile with his eyes. Andalite facial expressions are subtle. We see this a lot with Andalites, that they smile with their eyes, but apart from doing that, which I imagine is just sort of... I don't know. But apart from that, because they don't have mouths, which, let's face it, for humans, you've got all of these muscles around here are basically connected to the mouth. So anything you do with the mouth, so... Or... It's all associated with emotions. So take all of that away. Take all of that away, and what are you left with? Basically comes down to the eyes, which are a very expressive thing on humans. But also, I don't think Andalites have eyebrows. So basically, take all of that away. Basically, just get yourself a balaclava, put that on, and try to show expressions. That's basically it. They are the balaclava aliens. So yeah, they do have slight, subtle emotional communication on their facial expressions, but it is very, very limited. However, they do communicate through touch, so much like humans do. So humans will hug each other, or they'll pat each other on the back, good job, Sonny Jim. And Andalites do sort of have similar stuff, but also not as much. Even though touching is more of a human thing than an Andalite thing, it wasn't so bad. Chapman stood up and grabbed me roughly by the shoulder. I twitched my tail out of reflex. No Andalite would ever grab another Andalite. It was a Hork-Bajir kiss, I suppose. What we Andalites do when we stroke another's face with our palms. So on the one hand, Andalites don't touch each other, but on the other hand, Elfanga sort of liked it when he got touched. Moving on. And also they kiss by stroking, they're just freaking slapping each other across the face. Oh, I love you. Bang. Freaking... Let's move on from that as well. Christ. This is an absolute minefield. But it is weird how they say, oh, Andalites will never talk to each other. And yet they kiss. I suppose you could say that's like a partner thing, like a mating couple do that. But then we also get them touching their tail blades all the time, like thusly. Elfangor hesitated for just a moment before rushing on. He arched his tail forward. I reached forward with my own tail, arching it up over my back. We touched tail blades. Alaran's exuberance seemed to shake Axe out of his funk, and he raised his own tail to touch the blade to Alaran's. Welcome back, War Prince Alaran. I suppose I was being a bit harsh in the early comics. It does say an Andalite would never grab another Andalite, which is different to touching, so I will take that back. Andalites do generally touch each other, but they don't grab each other. So hugging probably isn't a thing in Andalite culture, because they'd probably consider that grabbing. But basically, Chapman comes up and, you know, he grabs Elfangor on the shoulder, which is a very human thing to do, a human bloke thing to do. So you'll sort of grab someone on the shoulders and look at it, oh, you're for yeah, it is a very human male sort of thing. Obviously, Elfangor doesn't like that, you know, what the frick is this? But they will touch their tail blades as a sign of affection or brotherly sort. That's the sort of slap on the shoulder. They touch tail blades like, yeah, mate. So that covers physical communication. Let's cover a couple of extra little things. So, gestures. So, pointing, for example, is something that apparently Andalites do. This is a Derishul tree, Axe said. He pointed to one of the asparagus-like spears that grew straight and tall. So Andalites do that. They point, which I suppose is, you know, it's pretty standard. I mean, it's very simple to understand, isn't it? You know, that you follow that. But then again, that's talking from a human's perspective, isn't it? I mean, my brother has got a 1-year-old, and pointing is now becoming a thing. It's more just sort of like that. But it used to be sort of all fingers out in one direction. Before that, it was just sort of like that. So it's not like a natural thing, it's a learnt behaviour. So apparently this must be the same with Andalites. And there's another thing as well, which comes from book 8, The Alien, which I tend to discount because it's very... just listen to this. He slowly winked one eye at Elfangor. I suppose we'll have to let the ruffian live. Andalites apparently wink, according to this, and they wink slowly, so it's just sort of like... I don't know, winking is weird. It happens too much in Animorphs. Every 5 minutes someone is going, I like you. Or, good job, Jake. I don't know, maybe it's an American thing, I don't know. We just don't do it over here in Britain. We're just like, oi, yeah. Shut up, mate. I don't know. What am I talking about? But apparently Andalites do it too. And it also, sometimes they nod their heads. So they'll be like, uh-huh, uh-huh. Sometimes they'll shake their heads like, even though a lot of times it says that that's a learnt behaviour that Axe learns from being around humans. So I think it's one of those things where the book series likes to do it because it's easy to understand, but also it's not an alien thing, so they have to learn it, and it's a bit strange. Sometimes it does actually say Axe has been learning to do this behaviour. But then sometimes we see Andalites doing it in the Andalite Chronicles or the Hawk-Bajir Chronicles, or even before Axe has really ingratiated himself into human culture. Whatever. Let's move on. Let's talk about telepathy. Now you could say, oh, we've done that, we've done thought speak. No, I'm talking about like images. Because this is something that happens a few times in the series. It's a bit different to thought speak, so just look at this. I guess he couldn't think of a word to explain Yeerk's. So he closed his eyes and seemed to concentrate. Suddenly, a bright picture popped into my head. I saw a grey-green slimy thing, like a snail without its shell, only bigger, the size of a rat maybe. It wasn't a pretty picture. Suddenly, we felt that blast of pain, straight from the alien. I could also feel his sadness. He knew his time was almost up. Suddenly, some new fear washed through the Andalite's mind. Linked as I was to him, I could feel it as a dread that crawled up my spine. You feel something warm seep in, like a curl of warm water swirling around you. The Andalite has sent you courage. This sort of links back to what I was saying earlier, that the Andalite thought speak was the evolved form of emotional communication, like they sense each other's emotions, and that is sort of what we're seeing here. So Jake feels the sudden pain that Elfangor feels. He actually feels it as if Elfangor is translating his emotional state to Jake, which seems to be the primitive form of Andalite thought speak. So that does make sense. What is different is that Elfangor is projecting images into the animal's head. Instead of finding the words to describe the Yeerk, he sends visual pictures, and this isn't the only time it happens. We ran, all but Tobias, who knelt beside the Andalite and shook his hand. The Andalite pressed his other hand against Tobias's head. Tobias rocked back like he'd been shocked. Then he, too, was up and running, stumbling over the loose junk and potholes of the construction site. At the end, Tobias explained, when the Andalite told us all to run for it, I stayed behind for a few seconds. I guess maybe I was too scared even to run. Anyway, he gave me visions, I guess you'd call them, pictures, information, a lot of it, all at once, all jumbled. I haven't even started to sort it all out, but I do know about the Yeerk pools and the Kandrona. Before Tobias left Elfangor's side, Elfangor put his hand to Tobias's head and just force dumped an encyclopedia of Andalite knowledge into his head. And then Tobias later down the line is able to sort through it and figure out what it all meant in time. So it's like he was sat at home inside his own head looking through his encyclopedia and studying it. It's all very weird, but apparently it is something that Andalites can do. So they send visual pictures, but the thing is we never really see it again. Not really, unless you count the Utsum thing later on, but we'll discuss that later because that's also a hive of weirdness. But yeah, apparently that is something that Andalites can do. It's just that they don't do it very often, where they just basically take a floppy disk full of memories and shove it into someone else's head. Was that just for plot convenience? Very possibly. Very possibly. I think we will discuss that at a future time. Let's now look at the final bit of Andalite ecology, the final bits of miscellaneous Andalite innate physical communication. What do I mean by that? Basically, innate communication. So, for example, when I'm nervous, I might, start playing with my facial hair or rubbing my arms or whatever have you. I don't choose to do that. I just do it. Or like my brother's little girl again. When she's tired, she just starts playing with her ears like that. I don't think it's a conscious choice. It's just an innate physical communication device. Let's look at some of those. The Andalite warrior was pacing back and forth, whipping his tail impatiently. He was angry. He was bitter. When an Andalite is angry or bitter, they'll pace around back and forth being all grumpers, and they'll be whipping their tail back and forth like, oh, I'm damn impatient, I am. So we do something similar, don't we? Except we don't have tails, so that's a bit... It's like walking back and forth going like that. Which I suppose some people do, but whatever. Stalk eyes. There's a lot of innate physical communication there, so let's look at the stalk eye communications. His stalk eyes drooped. He pawed the ground with one hoof. Never, he said. The Andalite looked surprised, I think. His main eyes widened, and his stalk eyes stretched up to their maximum height. It looked like surprise to me. I waved my stalks forward and back in a gesture of uncertainty. At the start of that one, we also got something to do with a hoof. So Axe is embarrassed. So his actions when he's embarrassed are his stalk eyes droop, and he starts to paw at the ground with one hoof, which seems like a pretty obvious gesture for embarrassment. But also, as well as the eye stalks drooping when he's embarrassed, they stick up when he's surprised. So they're very expressive, these stalk eyes apparently. So they'll go up and down depending on mood, side to side. They'll gesture, they'll move back and forward when there's uncertainty. So they are quite expressive little units. And then the last one now. And this is something we covered in the Hork-Bajir video, where we established that Hork-Bajir cry tears like humans do to express when they're in a state of despair. Do Andalites do the same? I felt like crying, but I no longer had human eyes. So I cried the way an Andalite does. Inside. In my heart. Andalites don't shed tears. which is an interesting little fact. So they cry the way Andalite does inside their 2 or 3 hearts, depending on how you took the previous part of the video regarding number of hearts. They cry in those. There's nothing comes out of here. No, nothing. I ain't crying. Kick them between the gonads and say, oh, you'll be freaking crying then. Anyway, that covers Andalite ecology, the way they interact with their environment, with other members of their race. That's that. So next up, we're going to move on to things like the Andalite demeanour, the state of mind, the politics, that sort of fun stuff. Go get yourself another drink and pause the video and come back when you're refreshed for more. So we've covered biology, we've covered ecology. Let's talk about what can be effectively put down to personality. Firstly, we're going to talk about the typical, and I say typical as in generally, the demeanour of the Andalites. What do Andalites come across as? What is the, I hate using the word default Andalite demeanour, but let's look at a few quotes now that tell us what being an Andalite is all about. You are highly intelligent, emotionally self-controlled, capable of lying and manipulation for your own ends. You are also fundamentally peaceful, moral, courageous, and capable of self-sacrifice. You are, in short, an Andalite, not a Hawk-Bajir. You could have been describing a human, Rachel said brightly. Now add in arrogant and humorless, and then you have an Andalite. That is a pretty good summation of what an Andalite is. So they are a peaceful race, they are usually on the good side of morality, usually, sometimes, but they're also very arrogant, very morally superior, they are capable of manipulation and lying, and they aren't known for their humour. In a lot of ways they're like us, but in a lot of ways they aren't. So we're going to go through this bit by bit, and we're going to start off with humour. Let's start off on a light note. So us humans, we like a bit of humour, whether it be puns or sarcasm, all the way up to paradox humour, dark humour, light humour, black humour. Is there a white humour? I don't know. But we cover a wide range of humour. Some is suited to some people, some aren't suited to other people, and whatever. The Andalites, however, just don't seem to do it. The Andalites could do with some of the human sense of humour, the Ellimist said. I am an Andalite warrior. That is all you need to know. No, Andalites don't make jokes, let alone human popular culture references. No, you are a human. Axe tries to pick up human humour. I think it was mostly just so he could feel like he fit in a bit more. But it never really hit. He never quite understood it. They don't know how humour works. It's just not part of their lexicon, is it? It's not part of their mind, humour. Which is unfortunate, because humour is what makes it so great to be human. You know, you could look at something that's really dark and sinister and evil happening, and you can make a joke about it. Marco is the perfect example. It's a way to lighten things, to remove yourself somewhat from something, to stop you just from feeling infinitely depressed all the time. You know, add a bit of humour. Sometimes laughter is, of course, the best medicine. A medicine that Andalites don't have access to. But it's almost as if the Andalites don't need it. Why? Because they are a naturally optimistic and typically very restrained group. I recognised the Andalite mind. Yes, it was all the things I'd imagined it would be. Confident, alert, poised for combat. But there was another element that took me off guard. Something bubbling happily away beneath the rationality. Nothing giddy like a dolphin's playfulness. Something less simple. Optimism. That was it. Intense optimism. Is there time? I don't know. Maybe we should hurry, Axe said in his annoyingly calm Andalite way. No one ever accused you Andalites of lacking courage. You are a race of fools, but brave. Andalites are very optimistic beings. Very brave, they're very, let's go into it, we'll be fine, glass is half full on this occasion. And that tends to be the typical Andalite way of looking at things, until of course it looks like they start to losing and they just blow everything up. But until that point, they're typically pretty optimistic of coming out of a situation with the best outcome. until it becomes impossible and they do just commit genocide. But we'll get on to that. But that's probably why they don't need humour, because humans, a lot of us are very optimistic, but there's also a lot of pessimism when it comes to being a human. And I'm sure a lot of you will agree that sometimes pessimism just sort of creeps up on you. And that's why sometimes you need humour to be put into a situation to bring you back to an even keel. I think that's the point of humour, is to, you know, keep away that pessimism and to bring you back a little bit of that optimism, to bring a smile. And yeah, Andalites don't necessarily need it. One of the biggest positives for the Andalite is that they are all about the two H's. Andalites are big on honour and honesty. Yeah, honour is a massive thing for Andalites. I think it's part of their warrior background, which is a very honour-driven way of life. I think you'll probably agree, the life of a warrior. It's about living to a code and, you know, being part of a hierarchy that overall is better for the society that you're in. Keeping to that on, it's like keeping to the law, you know. Things run more smoothly if you do that, and that's the whole thing about honour there. And that's also where the honesty comes in. They are capable of not being honest, but in general it seems like the Andalites do stick to that. From what we've seen, but we haven't really seen any civilian Andalites, so maybe it's a bit different. But now let's look at the more negative aspects of the Andalite demeanour. And that primarily comes from the sense of superiority. Andalite, the biggest Hawkbagia spat. Yes, Andalite, Axe said, with all the natural arrogance of his people. What a pity for you, Yeerk. This is not Yeerk technology, I can tell you that, Axe said. This is far beyond them. Far beyond us Andalites as well. What? Humility? From an Andalite? Listen to me, genius. This isn't a place for you. Why don't you go find some tree branches to chew on? Genius. It was one of the several sneering terms the Andalite warriors had for Hawkbagia. What could I do? Laugh and say, yes, we Andalites certainly are good teachers when it comes to ruthless self-interest. It might have been true, but it would have been stupid to admit it. This shows itself in more unlikable forms, the Andalite sense of superiority. Where they get that from, I'm not entirely sure, because they were largely influenced by the Ellimist, who probably wouldn't see this as a positive trait, but the Andalites do see themselves as the stand up, we are the best race here and we know what's what, and if you don't know what's what, then we're going to tell you what's what. They come across a bit like that. Very, what's the word I'm looking for? They're very insular. They're very xenophobic is probably a stronger way of putting it, probably a bit too strong, but that's the sort of line I'm going towards. Xenophobic, they don't like other races, they just sort of look down and say, scrape that off my hoof. And this, I mean, Dak was saying how the Andalites have sneering remarks for Hawkbagia, which is written across as if it's a general thing, not just from one specific Andalite warrior. It's as if all the Andalites just see them as something to be scraped off the back of the hoof. And this apparent level of xenophobia leads to a distrust of other races. An Andalite may think that humans are simple, open, trusting creatures, but they are more subtle than they seem to be at first. Possibly this is because of their spoken language, where no word ever means just one thing. Axe hesitated. He is still a little uncomfortable about being open and honest with humans. The Andalites are not used to trusting other species. You could say that this is a consequence of Cero's kindness, which is something that we know quite a lot about, and of course we will do an analysis of that in the future. But when you consider that apparently the Andalites live for centuries, from what we looked at earlier, from what I concluded, you're probably looking at between 1.5 and 2 centuries being the average Andalite lifespan. We also have to remember that Cero's kindness happened in 1966. I believe it was 1966, which during this book series is barely 30 years down the line. So that's not even an Andalite's teenage phase in length. So this lack of trust in other races is probably a lot longer lasting than Cero's kindness. It probably didn't just Cero's kindness happen and then suddenly the Andalites don't trust other races. No, I don't think unless I'm wrong, I don't think society works like that. You know, mistrust is a long-term, gradual, evolving thing. And I think that probably comes from the Andalites being largely a prey race, a prey species on their home planet, is where they got this distrust of other creatures from, and that's just naturally gone with them. Zero's kindness was probably an anomaly. And because of that anomaly, that was why they hit with such force in the other direction, saying, no, we don't give anything anymore. So I think the xenophobia came long before Zero's kindness. It just seems to make more sense that, yeah, for the reasons I've explained. But of course, they're not completely xenophobic. We've got to remember as well that the whole point of Zero's kindness happening was because that they went to study the Yeerks. Whether that was just because they thought, oh, that these things are funny, let's write books about them in that sort of condescending, arrogant Andalite way, and it just backfired on them. Zero, the Andalite, seemed to be a bit different to the other Andalites, and he thought that the Yeerks deserved what the Andalites had, and of course, turned out to be a bit of a mistake. But I think he's an anomaly, honestly. Now, to finish off, or largely finish off, the Andalite Demeanour section, we're just going to look at the level of emotion going on with Andalites. We sort of covered this with the facial expressions, but in general, the Andalites just don't seem to be very emotional people. I don't think Andalites approve of self-pity or other pointless emotions like that. Aldria seemed determined, upset, or as upset as an Andalite ever becomes. They are not an emotional people. This, I believe, comes back to the whole glass half full thing, because negative emotions tend to be a lot more visceral than positive emotions, I think, in most cases. So the fact that they don't tend to get that negative emotion, they probably don't have that bounce back or the reverse of massively happy emotions, so they tend to be very stable, emotionally cold creatures, and that is noticed by the other races that they interact with. Specifically, Hawkbajir and humans seem to operate on a bigger emotional level than the Andalites do. So we're talking relatively speaking, remember. Obviously, I'm a human, I'm talking from a human perspective. At least I think I'm human. Am I a human? Yeah, I'm definitely not a robot. But, Adam, you say, but we only ever talk to military Andalites. Surely they're different to the civilian Andalites. They probably show a lot more emotional wavering and yada yada yada. Well, I say to you, dear watcher, fiddlesticks. Andalite civilians are about 3 degrees more humble and lovable than the Andalite warriors we've always met. We do have the Animorphs after the war talking about the civilian Andalites they meet, and this quote is basically, I think it was Marco, saying that, yeah, civilians and military Andalites are basic, they're very little difference, they have the same sort of attitude. So I think we're talking general Andalites through all of this, not just military Andalites, we're talking in general, because that's the impression I get there. Speaking of military, let's move on to the Andalite military and just we will do a separate analysis on the Andalite military as a whole, but we've got to remember that the Andalites are a very warrior-based race, so they think a lot about their military. The military budget is probably a huge portion of what they have going on. So how big is this military? There are only 3 races left in all the known galaxy that still fight the Yeerks, Axe said proudly, and only the Andalites can stop them. The Andalites might have been the dominant species in this arm of the galaxy, but they were not invincible. Interesting that Axe mentions that 3 races are trying to stop the Yeerks. I don't think, from what I recall, that we ever get told which specifically are these other 2 races that are actively fighting the Yeerks, at least to an effective degree. But we also get the idea that the Andalites are the only ones advanced enough to actually take on the might of the Yeerk Empire. But like we learnt there, the Andalites of course are not invincible despite their sense of superiority and their apparently advanced nature. And of course the Andalite military is probably very complacent. They're probably very used to being the top dog, and the Yeerks come along and they think, oh, these little slugs, what damage could they possibly do? Apparently a lot. How many Hawkbajir had died, no one knew. Enough survived to supply shock troops to the Yeerks. It was a crime that seared the conscience of all Andalites. It was an evil so profound that we would never be free of its taint. Because of the failings of the Andalite military at the start of the Yeerk War, they effectively allowed and then fulfilled the destruction of the Hobbies race, which is probably seen as a terrible, terrible thing by the Andalite civilians. We're told that, and apparently that is the case. And the way that the Andalites seem to operate, it's almost like things get flooded back to the electorate, and they make decisions in an entirely democratic way, like pure democracy. Let's have a look at some examples of how the politics of the Andalites seems to work. My morning ritual is imposed on me by my society, I pointed out. Your society, human society, does not impose a similar requirement. The electorate has voted to allow more children to be born since we're in a war now. They say if the war goes on for long, and there are lots of battle deaths, some families may even have 3 and 4 children. Everyone must have someone over him. That is Andalite custom. Each warrior has a prince. Each prince a war prince. Each war prince has a great leader. And each great leader must be elected by the people as a whole. And everyone, no matter how great or small, obeys the law. It is the right and obligation of any Andalite warrior to challenge the order of a superior if he believes that superior is violating the fundamental rights of the electorate, the people. You're kidding, Margot said. How do people ever fight wars if you can challenge anything your superior officer tells you to do? If my challenge fails, I will be harshly disciplined, Axe said. I will be exiled, permanently, and my tailblade will be cut off. Alaran said, Asculin, under the law you may declare an emergency and continue until we can arrange for the challenge to be judged at a later time. But I do not see how a court could agree that this negotiation over prisoners can possibly be called a legitimate emergency, in which case you would lose your rank and position and be exiled. I know the law, Asculin snapped. What now? I asked Axe. He couldn't answer. He seemed to be shivering. Alaran answered instead. Asculin will contact the Fleet High Command. They will talk to their political advisors and try to decide whether they can win a challenge. It would be a sort of trial, with each side presenting evidence and witnesses. The entire Andalite electorate would have a vote. It would consume perhaps half a day. That's a lot of quotage I just gave you, and for a very specific reason. It just lays out what we know about how Andalite politics works. And it is a bizarre thing. It is almost the purest form of democracy. Almost its purest form. It seems to me that if a decision is going to be made, it gets channeled to the electorate, which effectively is all vote-capable Andalites, and within half a day they come to a decision and the law is changed thusly. And like Marco points out, how do you ever get anything done? Because as much as democracy largely is fine, it's not a perfect system. There is no perfect system. And that's why I think America has a pretty good system. It's a republic where there's a large democratic part to it, but it's also representation is skewed so that a minority group isn't basically trounced upon. Imagine, you've got a field full of wolves and sheep, and the wolves vote by a majority of 51 to 49 to eat the sheep. It's not great. But that is the system that the Andalites seem to use. So an officer in the military will go to his superior and say, I don't think you should be buttering your toast this morning. Oh, really? Are you going to challenge? He'll go back to his legal advisor, and then they'll put it to the electorate, and they'll say, should the officers butter their toast in the mornings? And the electorate half a day later will write back saying, no. And the person who was wrong, who's voted against, gets their tailblade cut off. And if we know anything about Andalites and the Vecols, which we will talk about later, they are effectively exiled from society. That is bonkers. But that's the checks and balances. Basically, if somebody thinks, oh, I might lose this decision, then it's a case of go ahead with it and see if it works, or get exiled from the community. So it's a pretty appalling system, honestly. Put it this way, let's put it into a human world context. So the taxes on the middle class are at 20% income tax. Okay, let's just put the hypothetical out there. It's 20% income tax. And somebody comes up and says, I think it should be a 10% income tax. Rather than going through the usual voting system that we do, where it's put through a campaign and people listen to that campaign and vote, and if they vote, the person gets in, and they might implement that. Instead, within a day, the electorate, the entire Andalite populace, is given a freaking fax form, and it says, today we're voting on changing the income tax from 20 to 10%. And they say yes or no, and then half a day later, whatever the majority decision is, goes. And let's say that 20% remains. The person who said, let's reduce the income tax to 10%, is exiled from society. That seems to be the way it is. And like that at the start, so Axe said that I have to do my morning ritual. It's deemed to be the done thing. It's the custom, as voted for by the people. There's also the child policy, where they say, at the moment we can't have that many kids, but if the war continues, then the electorate could vote to allow us to have 3 or 4 kids. And I don't know what happens if they break the law. Is there Andalite jails, or do they also get exiled? So if somebody acts, oh, I'm up the duff again, this is going to be my 3rd kid, do they get the tail blade cut off and exiled? I don't know. It's a bizarre and I'd say pretty backwards political mechanism, honestly. I much prefer the American system, the Republican, not the Republic, not the Republican, the Republic, the idea of a republic. I like that. Basically, it is the purest form of democracy, and if you're wrong in the Andalite democracy, then you better get out of there before you get kicked out of there. Seems to be the way it goes. But that probably means that nobody raises their voices, nobody issues challenges, so the status quo probably just remains a lot of the time. But you could say that it's basically a purely military thing, because we're talking about Askelin seemingly going against the will of the people. So you could say it's a different thing altogether. Maybe the whole democratic vote thing doesn't result in exiling, but we're talking specifically about a military officer doing something and somebody basically challenging him, saying, I think you're doing something that the people wouldn't like. Which, you know, is a subjective thing, I think, in this case. But then that's where the challenge is laid down, and if Askelin accepts the challenge and then he's proved to be doing something wrong, then he gets exiled. It's just a very bizarre system, and I don't know, maybe we'll cover it again in a later episode, just to, you know, give your comments, let me know what you think, see if I'm going in the wrong direction or if you think I'm going in the right direction. And we'll have another discussion about it some other day. But let's move on for now. It seems quite clear that Andalite politics is largely influenced by the military actions and by extension the actions of Andalites outside of the Andalite homeworld, and this is seen quite visibly when we talk about the Vember. Every Andalite knows the story of the Vember, Axe began. In fact, the story of the Vember has much to do with the modern Andalite policies and methods of interstellar interactions. If it is any comfort, the 5 are no longer in existence either. Soon after we encountered them for the first time, well, no one knows for certain what happened to the 5, but Andalites in that era are not the Andalites of today. Just a little snippet of what could have happened in the past regarding Andalite interstellar interactions, and the 5 and the Vember being a big part of that. Sorry, just heard a load of screaming outside. I don't know what's going on out there. It's the damn youths! But yeah, it's just a nice little snippet where we see something happened in the past and the Andalites' policies apparently changed because of it. So that's fine, you know, if something bad happens, then the policies should change to reflect that, the way society would like to see things go. So just to summarise the politics, that's the impression I got, that it's a pure democracy, and then if you break the laws, or if you're someone who looks at you and says, I think you might have broken the law there, then they challenge you, and if the electorate decides arbitrarily, right, we don't like you anymore, then you get exiled, basically. It's a very, very, what's the word? It's very full measure, isn't it? You know, there's no half measures in the Andalite politics. It's you're exiled or you keep yourself quiet, basically. I mean, that's the way it seems to me. I could be wrong. Let me know your thoughts. Well, let's now look at the last part of this section, the Andalite personality section. Personality in politics, I think we'll call it. And that is looking at what other people think of the Andalites. So we've seen how the Andalite military vaguely works. We've looked at Andalite politics, the Andalite Demeanour. How is that translated to other races? How do the other races perceive the Andalites? Visser 3 nodded. Yes. We lowly Yeerks know how superior you Andalites are. Holier than thou, the meddling moralists of the galaxy. The glorious, self-righteous Andalite princes saving the galaxy from the despised Yeerks. Do you expect me to feel badly? I asked. No, I expect the usual Andalite self-righteousness and hypocrisy from you, Eslin spat. Andalites, the meddlers of the galaxy. The Andalites are the busybodies of the galaxy, Karen said. Always sticking their noses in other people's business. We have a right to expand. We have a right to advance. But you Andalites don't see it that way, do you? No, the whole galaxy is to belong to the mighty Andalites. Karen snorted. Now I know you're an Andalite. Typical Andalite arrogance. The only race in the entire galaxy that makes war to help people. One can always count on two things from Andalites. That they will adopt a sanctimonious moral posture, and that when it serves their purpose they will quickly abandon that posture. Whatever became of the Andalite reputation for kindness and gentleness? The Yeerk mocked. Two sets of legs went to the Yeerk pool. I heard a hinge being moved. They're okay, a new voice yelled. Okay, the leader said, sighing in relief. No way we have Andalite penetration then. They'd never leave our people alive. Needless to say that the Yeerks do not like the Andalites, and we had a selection of quotes there to show it, but there's a general theme, so it's not just Visser 3, off on one of his mad ravings. We actually get it from quite a lot of Yeerks, and some of them turn out to be nicer characters. So for example, Aftran ended up being part of the Yeerk peace movement, so she was very much empathetic to the plights of other races. Eslin as well didn't like the Visser. He was in love and his lover died. Yeerk lover, if that's a thing. They are seen as holier than thou, in Visser 3's own words. Moral superiority, basically massive virtue signalers. So they'll come in and say, we do the right thing, until something bad happens, and then we'll switch course and do the other thing and claim that to be the right thing in that situation. We see that when they blew up, they genocided the Hork-Bajir. They thought they were doing the right thing, and then when it became too difficult, they suddenly said, to be fair, Alaran said it was the right thing to go genocide them now. That's now the right thing. They are meddlers. They go around policing the world. They're basically Team America, World Police. You remember that film? Where they go around and just solve all the world's crimes and just leave freaking destruction in their wake. Basically, the Andalites are Team America. That was a great film though, wasn't it? In all, they are good. They do things from our perspective, in this part of the world, the right reasons. They're all about freedom and liberty and all that great stuff. But they don't half cause a lot of trouble while trying to do it, and sometimes their methods can be very questionable. But of course we've only looked at quotes from Yeerks, and as we should know from the series, the Yeerks are... well... The Yeerks are very... basically put it this way. The Yeerks are very lowly creatures, and they don't have all the nice privileged things that the Andalites have, and they get jealous and bitter. And because they want those things too, they start building an empire and taking it by force, which is a bad thing. So we can take the Yeerk's perspective, but it's a bit biased. What about a Hork-Bajir's perspective? The Hork-Bajir arguably are the most peaceable and good guys of the series. The thought of an Andalite choosing to become Hork-Bajir had to be repellent to Axe, almost sacrilegious. Andalites are not known for their humility. You Andalites have more respect for the vicious Yeerks or the cowardly Arn than you have for the Hork-Bajir who fight and die at your sides. All that matters to your people is intelligence. Yeah, even the Hork-Bajir dislike the Andalites, and because of that first quote where they're just seen as lesser than. You know, the superior meddlers, the Andalites, will, you know, try to save the Hork-Bajir, but in the end they're just a different race and we don't really care so much about them, so who really gives a smeg if they end up genocided? So of course the Hork-Bajir look at that and say, well, we don't like you very much then. You know, we're not as intelligent as you, but does that make us worse people? My point of view is no. Level of intelligence doesn't make you a better or worse or less worth or more worthy person. But that's the way the Andalites look at things, and that's why the Hork-Bajir too very much dislike the Andalites. But let's not be too harsh on the Andalites. Even the Yeerks do see that the Andalites have some positive things going on with them. You Andalites are great ones for duty. Fenestra looked at me long and hard. I suppose I'll have to rely on Andalite honour, he said in a mocking tone. For all the awful reputation they've garnered over the many centuries that they've been meddling in space affairs, nobody can deny the honour, the duty-bound nature of the Andalites. So, there's that. Well done, Andalites. At least the people know that you're very dutiful. Shame about all the other stuff that you're perceived as. So let's now move on to the next section. It's time for another tea break. Go get yourself a drink, and next we're going to move on to Andalite culture. What fun. So let's talk Andalite culture. And we're going to start with something that we've sort of covered already, and that is the warrior, honour, duty culture that seems very prevalent amongst Andalite society. And it's not better encapsulated than it is here in Book 5, The Predator. It may be honourable to try and get a Yeerk ship axe, Jake said, but honour isn't our most important goal. The Andalite looked surprised, I think. His main eyes widened, and his stalk eyes stretched up to their maximum height. It looked like surprise to me. What else do you fight for, if not honour? Axe is shocked that the Animorphs might consider fighting for something other than honour, as if honour is the primary goal in all of this. You know, what if you're not fighting for honour, then what possibly could you be fighting for at all? Well, the thing is, only 3 books later, he says this. Axeman, Tobias said, tell me, what does an Andalite want most? What is it you guys are fighting for? For freedom, of course, I said. Only 3 books earlier, he was offended by the idea of you're fighting for something other than honour. Yeah, 3 books later, what are you fighting for, Axe? Freedom, of course. Honour? Pfft, that sucks now. We're all about freedom. So who knows what he's fighting? But this is the typical Axe thing. Throughout the series, he's flopping back and forth. Do I fight for this or do I fight for that? Well, today I'm going to fight for that, but then next time you see me, I'm going to go back to fighting for that again. It's just the Axe way, I suppose. But that doesn't take away from the fact that honour and duty is a big thing for the Andalites. Let's cover a few more quotes now, actually establishing that, rather than trying to find a contradiction. Axe suggesting something underhanded, that made me nervous. Andalites are big on honour and honesty. If Axe was suggesting subterfuge, the situation was even worse than it appeared. We cannot possibly win, Axe said. We know, Jake said. But if I have to lose, I'd rather lose fighting than let him catch us one by one. That is a very Andalite thing to say, Axe said. We have a lot in common. I wish it had ended differently. The victim of Sula's disease must abandon his imperfect body. He must become a Nothlit. Tobias looked at Axe with his intensely fierce hawk eyes. Sounds reasonable? No. In Andalite society, choosing to become a Nothlit in such a situation, or for such a purpose, is considered an act of cowardice, morally wrong, despicable. This all falls in line with the idea of the Animorphs being heavily bound to the ideas of honour and honesty. You know, if you get diseased, you know, if the cure is Nothlitism, then no, it's still bad because you're not being your true self. You're not being honourable to yourself, you're not being honest to yourself. That is who you are, and that's who you will remain being. You don't deliberately become someone else. And that seems to fall in line with that. So we're going to talk largely about the warrior culture, but before we delve deep into that side of it, we're going to stick to the honour side of it as well, because there is an honour aspect to, you know, who you kill or how much you kill in a warrior culture. So let's bridge the gap between these two subjects with these two quotes. We Andalites have fought wars among ourselves in the past. We did not kill children. It is not possible to conceive of a greater evil than the deliberate killing of a child. On the Andalite home planet, when a warrior becomes too fond of war, he is shunned. A warrior should love only the cause, not the killing. I think these are things that any sane person can agree with. That killing kids is morally reprehensible, and that a warrior should fight for the cause, not for the killing. Which is, I think, where Axe eventually starts to look at Rachel as if she's a bit wrong. Because she does start to love it more for the action than the reason. But now let's look at the actual warrior culture itself. We've looked at how it's tied to honour and how it can be regrettable, and there are some things that even though you're a warrior you simply don't do, such as the killing of kids, and you maintain the warrior culture for the reasons behind it rather than the actions taken to fulfill that. Let's travel to book 33, where we learn a bit of the history of the warrior culture of the Andalites. Our culture teaches us to temper and control our optimism, to give equal value to realism. We have become, regrettably, a race of warriors. But that is in response to necessity. Down deeper beneath that, I believe we are a peaceful species, in love with learning, not combat. But to learn and to fight, you must be joyful. I think an ancient Andalite inscribes that on a Shawmitor. Shawmitor? Tailblade carvings, made by early Andalites, mostly in the rocky outcroppings on the shores of the Illupera. We toured them once when I was younger. Ah. In fact, it was on Shawmitors of the Illupera that I learned the early tail-fighting masters spent a lifetime trying to cultivate and listen to instinct, trying to forget what culture had taught them. Let the innate defense mechanism kick in, as you humans say. This almost comes across as... What is it? Is it like, it's not the ninjas, is it? It's like the Buddhist monks that spend a lifetime meditating in the Nepalese mountains or whatever have you. It comes across like that, and they leave these tailblade carvings, the Shawmitors as they're called, talking about how they put aside the ideas of tradition and culture and just let the innate body defense mechanisms take over, so that they fulfill their path to being a true samurai warrior. Book 33 was weird, wasn't it? But that bit connects it all to the natural Andalite optimism, the feeling of joy, but also the honour side of it, the instinctual side of it. It all just sort of tries to come together there, but in a way it just sort of confuses it even more. But the Andalites are very traditionally warrior-like, even though part of being a warrior is to eschew tradition. That itself, ironically, became the tradition. And it comes with its own sayings as well, much like samurai warriors have their own sayings or whatever have you. Andalites have that sort of fashaz as well. Is fashaz a word? I don't know. I came across an old Andalite saying in the computer files. Know your friends well, know your enemies better. I'm pretty sure Sun Tzu, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, said that in a much more eloquent way than the Andalites managed. But regardless, they have their sayings. Know your friends well, know your enemies better. I mean, it's pretty bog standard, especially if you consider how advanced the Andalites are supposed to be. I mean, we came up with that thousands of years ago. Keep up, Andalites, come on. But this all also joins into the idea of Andalites being very hierarchical. Not specifically that quote, but I'm talking about the warrior thing. I'm rambling again, aren't I? Basically, I'm swinging it back now to connect it to this quote. Axe is convinced Jake is his prince. I guess Andalites are into the whole royalty thing. This isn't necessarily true. I believe it was Marco, because this is very early on after they find Axe and they use the word prince. And he's like, oh, the princes, this must be a royalty thing. It's not quite, because the Andalites are in a full pure democracy, effectively. So there's no room for some sort of monarchy or royal family or anything like that. But they do refer to each other in royal terms, which I think is just what the series decided to use because it sounded pretty funky. But that all does connect again to the Andalite culture, or the Andalite warrior culture, where you're an Aris, then you have a prince above you, a war prince above that, and that all circles back to what do the people require, and it starts the cycle again. And I think it falls neatly into that warrior culture package. And what else does as well? Certain customs, certain ways of thinking. And one of those ways of thinking is that vengeance must be taken when your family is wronged. By Andalite custom, the murder of a family member must be avenged. I had just been face to face with him, and I had done nothing. Yes, I had been surrounded by Hawk-Bajir, and because I was young and not yet a full-fledged Andalite warrior, I could say that the full burden of revenge had not yet fallen on me. A warrior is duty-bound to avenge a family member who has been murdered, and that's a big thing for Axe. At least until the very last book, where this just isn't a thing anymore. Hey look, it's the guy that I've been sworn to take revenge on for the whole book series. I'm just going to let you have him, Marco. In a little box, yeah. God's sake, Axe. But until that last part, Axe is sworn to avenge Elfangor by taking the life of his murderer, Visser 3, or Esplin 9466, and he spends a lot of time contemplating that, of course, until the very end when he actually has the opportunity. But let's just forget that for now. The Andalite warrior culture is very much built on an eye for an eye sort of thinking, it seems to be. That is, of course, until it's implied there that Axe doesn't necessarily take on that role until he is a full-fledged warrior. So it might not be a civilian thing, it might be purely a warrior thing, and so until you're a full warrior, you don't necessarily take on that responsibility. But how do you become a full warrior? Well, apparently they have academies for this sort of thing. We have no high school on the Andalite home planet, but we do have the academy. I was an Arith in the academy, what humans would call a cadet. Now this is very interesting, and it starts to take us away from the warrior culture to the grander Andalite culture as a whole. They don't have high schools, which of course, Britain doesn't have high schools. We have secondary schools and primary schools. I think Axe is talking in the grander sense of they just don't have schools that aren't military focused. What does that mean? From my perspective, it's either one of two things. Either there are no schools unless you're specifically joining the military, or the military schools are sort of like your public schools, and if you want a non-military education, you go into private education. And maybe you get your tuition from the home scoop, purely that alone. So I'm sort of thinking it's one of those two things. If it's the former, then apparently females just don't get an education. Because it's mostly males that join the military, and females go and do horticulture and creative arts and stuff like that. In which case there is no school for them. So they're all... Which is what lends me to thinking it's a lot of private education. So unless you join the military, you get taught at home as if it was some sort of private... No, it's not even private school. That's homeschooling, isn't it? That's homeschooling. So maybe that the Andalites are just big on homeschooling, which, I wouldn't say it's not unlike them. It's just a thing. I'm starting to get the feeling that's the case, that if an Andalite, usually a male, is going to join up with the military, then they'll get shipped off to the academy. And they will stay close to their home scoops, because Axe did mention that earlier on. You know, if I was back in the home planet, even though I was a cadet, I'd still live in the home scoop. So these Andalite academies must be spread out over the planet, and primarily male Andalites will go to these academies, go home. It's like a regular school day. Whereas those that aren't joining the military, so primarily females, will probably just spend most, or if not all of their time in and around the home scoop, teaching themselves other skills such as horticulture or the creative arts or driftball, whatever. What do we know about the Andalite schools then? Well, it would seem to be that they're all military focused, and we never actually see inside one, but Axe will occasionally cut into a conversation and talk about his school life. Yes, Axe said. I guess so. I did not recognise it. I have only heard it once, and that was in school, and I wasn't paying attention. It almost made me laugh. The image of an Andalite classroom where Andalite students zoned out on the lesson just like we did. But it really wasn't a good time for laughing. We will cover more on Andalite schools in a future AniLysis. What happens after school life? Well, for most of us, after school life you go into work life. What is work life like for Andalites? We kept building spaceships, but we did it in little bits and pieces, here and there, spread out through the tens of thousands of scoops. My own family does some of that. We design heat transfer components for fighters. Another family builds the pieces from our designs. Another family transports the pieces to the spaceport. I guess the 3 spaceports are about as close as we come to what you would call a city now. Andalite work life, from what we see, tends to revolve largely around the military, much like pretty much everything else. So we're starting to draw that conclusion now that basically the Andalites are a militaristic alien race, and pretty much everything they do will eventually turn into something military. What Elfango's talking about there is that there are tens of thousands of home scoops, and they effectively do work at the home scoop and send everything off to 3 major spaceports that are present on the Andalite home world. I mean, is it done by foot? Are they just designated a role? We don't know, or whether one family is historically good at making component X, and so the family signs up to do that. And then so the other scoops are made aware of those are the guys that make component X. So we've got the plans for where component X needs to go. So we make those plans and send them to that scoop, and they send their information to that scoop over there. It's like one big web. So it's a very unusual way of doing things, but apparently it works. And then eventually the final products are sent off to the major spaceport, where, of course, you'd probably get a big work culture there, where a bunch of other Andalites spend time working in these spaceports. But there's only 3, so it's a very niche role. But then again, everything seems to be a niche role. Like, every single scoop has their own purpose. Like, individual, unique purpose. And yeah, it's a very unusual way of doing it. Very alien, very sci-fi. I do enjoy it. But of course, after a long day of making component X and sending that off to Scoop Y, receiving parts from Scoop Z, you want to relax and indulge in some arts or entertainment or whatever have you. What do they have for entertainment on the Andalite homeworld? Barafin spent his days near the Scoop, playing combat games with the computer. Tail fighting is a sport, an art, and a deadly combat skill. You could play 3 separate games of driftball at once in that space. Cassie is a natural estrine, a person with an ability to make morphing almost artistic. On my planet, it is an art form. There are professional estrines who change shape in fantastic, beautiful ways. Like with pretty much everything else, it all comes back to something militaristic or something to do with the warrior culture. So most of the things we learn about in terms of Andalite entertainment, it is combat games that can be played on computers, so basically the Andalite version of Call of Duty that Barafin plays. Tailblade fighting as a sport, as an art, as a combat skill. And then you have estrines, which use the Morphing technology, which is a militaristic tool. The only exception to this seems to be driftball, which is mentioned a couple of times throughout the series. We don't know the rules of driftball, but I'm sure at some point I will come up with an official driftball rule set. But that is the only thing we know that the Andalites do that isn't connected in some way to the military, is this idea of driftball. There are a couple of bits elsewhere though, outside of the usual realms of entertainment, and let's look at art and aesthetics. Maybe it's a bit less militaristic in the arts and aesthetics field. According to Axe, Tobias explained, gardening is a very cool hobby for Andalites. It's an art, really. It was surprisingly simple. It looked cosy, almost. Everything was a creamy colour, with rounded edges and shapes that tended to be oval. And that we call Enos Ermav. What? I didn't see what he was pointing at. That. The way the lake curves forward into the grass, framed by derishal trees. You have a word for something like that? I asked. There are names for all the many ways the water and sky and field interact, he explained. And for the way the suns and the moons hang in the sky of our planet and cast their lights in one way or another on the different aspects of the world. I don't want to be a zero space theorist or a grasscape designer or a cloud artist. The Andalites love a bit of gardening. So they do stuff that isn't necessarily connected to the military. And they see it as a very artistic thing, as with the other stuff we talk about there. So cloud art. What was it again? Yeah, cloud artist, grasscape designer. They talk about Enos Ermav. They have specific words for the way that various geographical features interact with each other. Geological features interact with each other. So outside of the military stuff, they are very, very artistic, and they love the way that things look naturally. And that goes back to looking at the Andalite ship, where everything's cream coloured and oval, like there's no corners. The Andalites obviously do not like that. They love everything looking like it was naturally formed, which typically comes in curves and swoops and things like that. So that all seems to match up with this idea of the Andalites being very much in love with the natural world. And what better way to illustrate that than by showing that they don't do things that aren't related to that. So you've got your warrior culture and you've got your, oh, we love nature. But what other things do we do as humans? We do things that are very, well, for example, we have lawyers. Rachel's mother is quite quarrelsome. I'm told that is because she is something called a lawyer. A lawyer seems to be an odd type of human. Intelligent, but in a way that is not terribly useful. At least to my Andalite sensibilities. All they seem to use their intellect for is argument. Not philosophical contemplation or artistic pursuit. What better way to show how artistic the Andalites are than by showing this quote where Axe is basically saying, this human has a role that isn't to do with art. What is this? Yeah, so apparently Andalites don't have lawyers. They just call them something else. Axe was to my right, not sitting. They had removed chairs so he and Alaran and an official Andalite legal observer named Salawan could stand comfortably. An Andalite legal observer. Sounds a bit like a lawyer to me. Well, I don't know, maybe an Andalite legal observer observes legal stuff by painting it. I don't freaking know. Salawan stood there in the courtroom painting what he believes happened. And Axe is like, oh, that's what a lawyer's like. It's just that the humans do it without the painting. Right, got it. And he's not doing artwork in the clouds either. Or maybe the Andalite legal observer is just very philosophical. Because, maybe he's doing Z-space theory in the background of all of this. But yeah, Andalites, outside of the warrior culture, it's all very artistic and philosophical. Those are the two main branches of the Andalite culture. Anything other than that, and they just, what is this? And we move on from the artistic and philosophical side to something sort of similar, and that is the sentimentality of Andalites. What is sentimentality? Basically, if you weren't sentimental, you'd hold nothing close. Like, for example, this little doohickey here. I've got a little figure. It's not a figurine. It's a ceramic cat thing that I just have sitting here. Why do I have that? Because I'm a cat owner. I like cats, and so I look at that and think, I like that. Just purely sentimentally. There's no necessary need for me to have this, or posters on the wall or anything like that. Sentimentality is, so far as I'm aware, just something that you keep a hold of because it's something personal to you. You have a personality. This item emphasizes your personality or reminds you of certain aspects of your own personality, and so you associate it with you and you hold it close. That, in a way, to me, is sentimentality. And Andalites have that sentimentality. Axe nodded. Yeerk pools are generally large and elaborate. They're an important part of Yeerk life. The centres of their lives, really. The pools are, for the Yeerks, what forests and meadows are to Andalites. Andalite creatures live in greater harmony than Earth animals. I thought of the Kafit birds, the Hobbies and the Jabalas. We practiced morphing these creatures, but caging them, killing them, eating them was unthinkable. We were creatures of the same world. I had already packed up my few personal belongings. My hollow of our scoop back on the home world. The Packer-doll my mother had given me when I was a child. The wishflower I'd kept from when we were hoping to have Barafin. A Shawm is a deep friend. Someone you never lie to. Someone who knows all your secrets. The word Shawm means tailblade. See, it's supposed to mean a person you would trust so much that they would put their tailblade right up against your throat and you wouldn't even worry. You see, I would consider all of these things aspects of sentimentality. So Axe compares Yeerk pools with forests and meadows for Andalites. This idea of this is the central hub of our society. This is where we want to be. And I believe there is a sentimentality to that. And that extends to the creatures of that world they inhabit. So the Hobbies and the Jabalas, the Andalites would refuse to do harm to these creatures because they share the same world. That, in a way, is sort of a survival thing, but in a very meta, grander scheme of things. But on a ground level sort of thing, it's a very sentimental approach. We share the same world, therefore we live amongst you creatures and we enjoy your company. That to me strikes me as very sentimental. So when they share the same world with another creature, they show a great deal of respect to those creatures. Unlike those Hork-Bajir over there, might as well genocide them. Hoobers, we got your back, son. And then of course you got things like the Packer-doll, the Wishflower. They have images, photographic images of family members, which is a very sentimental thing. So yeah, the Andalites are a very sentimental race. And then of course you've got the idea of a Shawm, which is a sentimental thing where you've got like basically your best friend and you have your rituals surrounding that. So let's move on from that to the more ritualistic side of things. I think that's a nice shift, an appropriate shift. Andalites have marriage. Force Commander Prince Galuit Enilon Esgaruth lost his entire family to a Yeerk raid on an Andalite outpost. His entire family, wife and 3 children. Axe refers to Galuit having a wife. I believe this is the only time where the word wife, or alternatively husband, is used regarding Andalites, but it is used here, which does imply the idea of some form of marriage, a ritual of marriage among the Andalites, where I suppose a male and a female Andalite back on their world joined in communion and they form the family and proceed from there on out. Who knows whether they have like gay marriage or whether they have divorce? We don't know. That's up to your speculation. Seeing how the Andalites are, I doubt they probably have either of those two things. I thought there's just something about the Andalites which makes me think they wouldn't have those two things. But anyway, what other rituals do Andalites have? This is the Hirak de Lest of Elfangor Serenial Shamtul, Andalite Prince. I open my mind in the ritual of death. I open my mind and let all my memories, all my secrets, go to be recorded by the computer. Now, in addition to the morning ritual and the evening ritual, I have to do the Wishflower ritual. And you have to do a Wishflower ritual at the Wishflower, of course. I knew the ritual of forgiveness. Everything is a ritual to these Andalites. So I imagine the marriage is named ritual, like a ritual of marriage or ritual of communion. Then there's the ritual of forgiveness, the ritual of death, whereby Axe did his Hirak de Lest, the ritual of the Wishflower, which is something to do with childbirth. And all these rituals, they will be covered in separate AniLysis, so we're not going to delve too deeply into that. But I get the feeling there's also a funeral ritual as well, judging by these quotes. The Andalites treated her body with great respect. She had been wrapped in some sort of cloth. I guess it was the Andalite way. Arbron was flown back to the Andalite homeworld and given a quiet funeral. For humanity, rituals are often associated with religion and religious practices and traditions and stories. So now we're going to move on from this to those aspects. So we're going to start off looking at the sort of stories that the Andalites tell each other. And it seems to be primarily geared toward kids' stories, you know, like nursery rhyme sort of stories or like Disney stories or whatever have you. The Andalites tell fairy stories of the Ellimists. They see them as tricksters, unreliable, creatures who use their power in unpredictable ways. The sky directly over the dark, unnerving landscape was dirty green and veined with silent lightning. It looked altogether like one of the fantasy monster lands and fables that Andalite parents tell their little children about. Although we Andalites are not superstitious, we do have our own ancient myths of dark, deep places within the ground, places of fear and loathing, and those myths were surfacing in my mind now. It sounds like the Brothers Grimm sort of things, doesn't it? Like the old fairy stories, and it does mention fairy stories there, and it largely revolves around the Ellimists, plural in this case, talks about monster lands and pits of deep horrors and loathing. They don't seem to tell nice stories, but then again we don't know, because we get very, very little information in this regard, but we do know that they tell like little horror stories to their kids, sort of like the Brothers Grimm. Like today, kids get told nice stories about sharing and giving things, whereas back in the day, about 100 to 200 plus years ago, it used to be, if you were a naughty boy, freaking one-legged Charlie would come down the chimney and slice your shins off, you know, that sort of thing. It was pretty grim, but you know, people had more respect in those days. Cause correlation, who knows, but maybe that's why the Andalites do it. They fill these kids' heads with all these awful stories because it sets them straight. Perhaps there's something to be said about that. But talking about the Ellimists, they do sort of delve into the spiritual realm, even though the Andalites typically will be all about, well, we're all about reason and logic. Then they'll start doing this sort of stuff. Next taxon to come out, we go in, I said. What if another taxon doesn't come out? Axe wondered. Don't you Andalites believe in luck? No. Me neither. How about hope? We believe in hope. I don't believe in psychic things, although some Andalites do. A series of memories, so intense. I was drowning in pain, Axe. I really thought I was dying, and then, all at once, I felt the icy cold steel of a tail blade against my forehead, and Axe made a sort of gasping sound and dropped his spool of string. His eyes were wide with a startling intensity. A blade? Against your forehead? He trailed off, his voice quaking with surprise. Axe? What? He was clearly disturbed, like I'd just shaken his reality. He shook off whatever it was and regained his customary composure. No, he said, more to himself than to me. It's all nonsense, of course. We are a rational people. What is it, Axeman? He started hesitantly. A legend. A spiritual rite, really. Utsum. Certain medicine men believe that they could pass memories through DNA. Legend says these memory messages are triggered by imminent death. A surge of strength during the last moments to ease their passage. Ancient superstition. So Axe will start out saying, we don't believe in luck, no Andalites believe in luck. Then he'll sort of say, some Andalites believe in psychic things. Me, no, but other Andalites maybe. And then in book 33 he's like, did you say Utsum? That's the spiritual thing that the medicine men tell us about. The ghosts of Christmas past hath haunted me. He's come a long way, Axeman. But the Utsum thing was just weird, and I didn't like book 33 for reasons such as this. So Axe is talking about the Utsum, the thing where through DNA they pass memories, like image memories. You know, the thing that happened to you in book 1 that pretty much everyone knows about at this point. And then we never hear from it again. It does sound like just the sort of thing that everyone had taken for granted up till this point. The fact that Tobias knew about the Yeerk pool and the Kandrona is because Elfangor, at the point of his death, gave his memories to Tobias, and then Tobias basically told everyone. And I know Axe wasn't present during that time, but Axe and Tobias probably talk enough to each other that this shouldn't have come as a surprise to Axe. The Utsum, the spiritual thing. That's... yeah. So Axe goes from basically, I don't believe in things like luck, I'm not superstitious at all the way now to the spiritual demonic possession. It's happening. The thing that is happening. Oh, and then we just never talk about it again. So there's that. God's sake. But he sort of tries to have it both ways. He says the Utsum is this thing that's passed through DNA, which means it should probably be able to be tested. And it just comes across as another form of thought speak, but also it's a spiritual right that the old medicine men used to tell us about. What is it? I mean, we will discuss this in a separate analysis, by the way, so we're going to move on from that. But talking of medicine men, they do like a bit of the old herbal medicine, the Andalites. This facility uses ARN biotechnology matched with Andalite computer technology to formulate and produce biological specimens. I frowned. What biological specimens? Oncologium. That's an organic medicine, I told Dak. I have grown the Ilsipar from seeds from my home world garden, Gfindaland explained. In his oddly huge hand he held 5 or 6 stalks of what looked like scallions, except pinkish. It is a hardy plant and grows well here. I watched, almost fascinated, as both Andalites placed several stalks of the root on the ground and then proceeded to eat them in the normal Andalite fashion, crushing the plant beneath their hooves and absorbing its nutrients. Then the almost fascination ended. It seemed the Andalites had forgotten I was there. Ilsipar root has a medicinal use as well. In great quantities it eases the pain of Sula's disease. This is a genetically programmed disease. It causes increasing pain in the joints as well as the muscles, extreme at the end. In some it causes progressive blindness. It strikes in the prime of life and is always fatal. They love a bit of organic medicine. So the Ilsipar root comes across as very much that stuff that smells awful. I'm not sure if YouTube will let me say what it is, but just put it this way, it's the stuff that absolutely stinks and I hate it. Just for that reason alone, I hate the freaking smell of the stuff. But they also have Oncologium, which, as Aldrew explains, is an organic medicine. So that is the medicine that they use, and they use the tools that the earth naturally provides to cure them of various diseases and whatever have you. We also got further confirmation of what I concluded earlier in how the Andalites crush things with their hooves to smush it into almost a liquid form, and then they will basically take in that liquid from there. So going back earlier, that's almost confirmation. They use the organic medicine in very much a comforting way. So the Andalites, once they've had this Ilsipar root, seem to get sort of spaced out, that sort of thing. Must be some sort of comfort to them. And indeed, the Andalites do enjoy a bit of comfort. Sometimes they actually prioritise comfort over practicality. This is the main part of an Andalite dome ship. It is where we live. You all live here? Marco wondered. I mean, just out in the open? Out on the grass? Where else would we live? Here we have space to run. There must always be space to run. There is no greater example of comfort over practicality in the Andalite culture than the dome ships, because it makes them so goddamn impractical, as seen when Elfangor's dome ship was blown out the sky because it had to take off the dome and then turn, and by that point the Yeerks were just like, oh screw this, bang, out the sky you go. But it's there because it provides them with the comfort, even though it lessens the practicality of what's going on, so they do enjoy their personal comforts. And another example of this is in the fact that they don't use clothing. Clothing is not a uniquely human idea, but of course Andalites do not indulge in it. Andalites do not indulge in the silly idea of clothing. That is, of course, until it becomes a necessity. The airlock was big enough to accommodate 4 space-suited Andalites. Andalites do actually have forms of clothing, as demonstrated there. They have spacesuits, which is an absolute necessity. Unless you're talking about the Andalite Chronicles, in which case Elfangor basically puts a fish bowl over his head and walks out into space. But yeah, later on they realise, hold on, they actually need spacesuits. So they do wear big spacesuits, and I don't think we've ever seen pictures of that. Like artists, come on Ghost of Essam, get on it. An Andalite in a big spacesuit, it should be quite funny. So, we've covered that aspect of things now, and we're going to move on to something that I can't quite bridge to as easily. But we recently, in the video, talked about the insularism of the Andalites, the xenophobic nature. So let's bring that back around now and talk about the insular nature of the Andalites, the cultural aspect of that xenophobia. They were the ones who told me of Elfangor's last minutes of life. He had broken Andalite law and custom by giving these humans the power to morph. Aruth Aximile Escaruth Ishil, you have done a brave thing taking on this guilt. I know the temptation to go beyond the law when helping a brave people fight the Yeerks. I was an advisor to the Hobbies. They were our allies, but they were not Andalites. They were not our people. We have secrets, we Andalites, and the greatest secret of all is our own guilt. We're Andalites, I said, not Yeerks. We aren't interested in ruling other species. I know this part is sort of loosely thrown in there, but I couldn't quite put it anywhere else. But because we're talking about culture, we've got to include this sort of section in the culture bit where it is a large part of their culture and their laws. So they will not give out information or help out other creatures if it goes against their customs, their culture. Such as the Hawk-Bajir, as Liram puts across there quite neatly. That insular nature therefore translates into the Andalites also not wanting to conquer other races on different planets because they just don't want anything to do with it. Why is that? Because of the Andalite collective guilt. So underneath all this Andalite culture, all this Andalite tradition, there is a deep sense of guilt. You would suspect it's because of the Hawk-Bajir thing, but as I alluded to earlier, I think that's too recent. There must have been stuff in the past, and remember we talked about the Five, how Axe said the Andalites have changed over the years after what happened with the Five. So it's obvious in the past that the Andalites, as a military race, wiped out other races that they deemed unworthy. And so this is translated down into the Andalite culture, and they hold on to these secrets, and they hold them quite deeply, which is what it also might cause this xenophobic nature. They don't want to involve themselves in other races because they might repeat the mistakes of the past. And that is translated into the Andalite culture. And that's why I've brought it into this section here. So let's now move on to another loosely related segment, Vecolism. This is one of the more unfortunate parts of Andalite culture. So what is Vecolism? Vecolism is, effectively, the disabled. A Vecol! There was disbelief in Axe's voice. Something else, too. More than his normal, well, arrogant tone. It sounded like disgust. Excuse me? I asked. He is disabled. A cripple, Axe answered coldly. And his presence here will obviously be a problem. An Andalite without a tail is just sad. Now, of course, this isn't as bad as genocide. But discriminating against the disabled is also, on the scale of good to bad, is somewhere down the B side of that section, okay, rather than the G side. And this is not something that is ever properly addressed by Axe. He just remains a bigot against disabled people for the rest of the series, basically. That you could argue that he sided with James and the other disabled kids, but Axe was more just sort of a bystander and all that. And yeah, he never really recounted his bigotry. But it is a general thing amongst the Andalite culture. And obviously, the way that Andalites vote and do things, it being a pure democracy, that means that the majority of Andalites think that the Vecols should be isolated from society. It is unthinkable to intrude upon the isolation of a Vecol, Axe explained. His isolation is the only dignity he has. and like custom ordains these disabled live in isolation. It is largely for their own sake, as they would feel great shame as part of society. So it is out of respect for Vecols that they are kept from full participation in the world. It's for your own good. It's for your own good that we shun you from society. Keep your respect, keep your dignity, and bugger off. It's awful, isn't it? But that is the Andalite culture, and they voted for that because they are a pure democracy. So go to the majority of Andalites and they'll be like, yeah, you know, for their own sake, just banish them. Just don't let them near me. I don't want to see them. The less said about this, the better. So let's move on. And we're up to the last bits of culture now. So we're just going to cover something that I couldn't quite fit anywhere else, and that is how Andalites greet each other. I saluted and made the traditional Andalite bow. So when Andalites come to each other, they have a traditional bow, which it's largely in the stalk eyes and the upper torso, so they just sort of bow it forward. And that seems to be how Andalites, once greeted with each other, they carry out this bow. There's also a weird thing that happens in Book 4 that never happens again, and it's the way that Axe talks about his fellow Andalites. You do not travel the stars. You know only your own planet. My elder cousins have taught me this. In Book 4, Axe is always talking about his cousins, referring to other Andalites. And then it just never happens again, so far as I'm concerned. Axe doesn't refer to them consistently as cousins after Book 4. So it was obviously something that was sort of retconned, whereby the Andalites would refer to other members of their race as cousins. So I believe we can strike this one from the record, unless you can prove to me otherwise that he does consistently say it afterwards, but I'm pretty damn sure he does not. Because go to Book 4 and read it, and the amount of times he throws that word in there, that regularity certainly does not happen after that point. Put it this way, I've gone into the PDF for Book 52, where Axe is talking a lot to other Andalites and about other Andalites, and there is not a single mention of cousin or cousins. So yeah, it just stopped happening. So finally, to finish off the culture part of this video, let's talk about how Andalites are named and how they name each other. Firstly, by going over a nickname. Axamilikala, my father said. It was his nickname for me. Axamilikala. We never hear that again, but it appears that Andalites will give each other nicknames. Kala being maybe a name for a son? We don't know, but it is said specifically there that it is a nickname. So Andalites will use nicknames when referring to other people, clearly family members. That is the only time we ever see it though, so there's probably more there are probably more out there, but Kala is the only one we know about, and we can speculate that it means son, I'm assuming. I could be wrong. Let me know your thoughts. We also know that Andalites shorten their own names for ease. I even took a human name, Alan Fangor. It was Lauren's idea. See, humans shorten their names, just as Andalites do. So most people call me Al Fangor. What does Al Fangor mean by this? Well, Andalites have three major parts to their name. And so when the Andalites are talking to each other in the context of the Animal series, the majority of the time they will refer to the first name, so Elfangor, or Arbron, or Alaran. That's what he means by they're shortening the name. So instead of Alaran saying Elfangor Serenial Shantal, he'll just say Elfangor. Now let's look at the actual full Andalite name, shall we? I am Aximili Esgaruth Istil. It is typically always a three-part name separated by two hyphens in the middle. There are times in this series where Elfangor would say, these humans reduce my name to Axe because my main name is, though it is easy for us Andalites to say, it is more difficult for humans to say. So Andalites have no problem saying each other's full names because they are a bit of a mouthful at times. Let's have a look at Axe's family. So Axe's full name is Aximili Esgaruth Istil. He gives the full names of his other family members. Let's see if we can spot a pattern. My name is Aximili Esgaruth Istil. I am an Andalite, son of Nualin Serenial Kurat and Forle Esgaruth Mahin. younger brother of celebrated war prince Elfangor Cyrenial Shamtul. I'm just going to leave this note on the screen for now. Sorry if it distracts with the whiteness. But there does seem to be some form of pattern here. So the parents are Nualin Cyrenial Korat and Forle Esgaruth Maheen. I'm trying to remember where we figure out which one is the mother and father, but I'm reliably informed by Cyropedia, thank you Cyropedia, that Nualin Cyrenial Korath is the father of Elfangor and Aximili. Why is that relevant? Well, I'll tell you why it's relevant, because so if Nualin, his middle name is Cyrenial. Elfangor, being the oldest son, has Cyrenial as his middle name. The mother who has a middle name of Esgaruth, and so Ax has the middle name of Esgaruth. So it seems to me that the father's middle name becomes the first child's middle name. And so if we, for example, look at Aldria, she was the first child of Ciro. Aldria's middle name is Ischilion, so we can probably assume that Ciro's middle name is Ischilion. So Prince Ciro Ischilion something else. And then if we look at the first name, they're all completely different. So like our names, for example. And then the last name is the same, it seems. So picture it this way. If my name hypothetically is Barry Humphreys, then if I were an Andalite, it would be something along the lines of Barry Humphreys Dave, and just put 2 hyphens in the middle. What do I mean by this? Well, my middle name is decided by what my parents' middle name is. So imagine if, with the Andalites here, so just take out the last name. So Aximili Esgaruth. Obviously, the mother's name is Forle Esgaruth, so it's almost like a last name, where it's just passed down, except they add another first name at the end. So another arbitrary name. Of course, it's still a bit different, because if it were purely the case that the paternal last name were passed down, then Aximili's name would be Aximili Cyrenial Isthil. But it's not. It's Esgaruth, which is the mother's middle name. So I believe I've established some form of pattern. Who knows what the pattern is for the third name? I do believe it's probably just another arbitrary thing, like the first name that we have. So my first name is Adam. Was that dictated by some custom or culture? No, my parents just thought, right, what's the first name that comes up in the list? There it is. And we don't like Aaron with 2 A's, so we'll just go for Adam. Yeah, apparently that's why they named me that. Thanks, Mum and Dad. At least it's better than my mum, because she doesn't have a middle name, and her first name is Kay, because apparently her parents just wanted her name to take up as little space as possible. They did love her, and they were lovely parents, but they were just like, oh, screw long names, just have it as short as possible, don't even need a middle name. At least I've got a middle name. Ironically, it's my granddad's name, so... yeah, there's a bit of backstory for you. But that just seems to be how Andalites are named. Arbitrary first name. Middle name is based on the middle name of the parents, based on whether you're the first or second child. Who knows what happens after that, but then again, it's against the law apparently at the moment to have a third child. And then the third name seems to be arbitrary as well. So that seems to be how it goes. That's it for Andalite culture now, so it's time for you to, if you wish, to take another break. The next topic we're going to discuss is intelligence and technology. So we're getting into the technical side of things. Or the technological side of things. Whatever. Let's start this section by talking about Andalite intelligence. They are perceived by not only themselves, but pretty much everybody else as being the most, if not the most intelligent race in the galaxy. How far the galaxy stretches is a topic for another video, but let's have a look at some quotes. You Andalites always have been clever when it comes to science. I don't know if Axe is smart for an Andalite, but he's really smart by human standards. We Andalites know more about alien races than anyone in the galaxy. We have been in space longer and travelled farther. Plus, we are scientists as well as warriors, so when we find a new race, we study it. as opposed to wiping it out or enslaving it, as the Yeerks do. I guess some of the story I'm about to tell will appear in the scientific journals. It's not explicitly said that they are the most intelligent species / race in the galaxy. But throughout the series, that is the impression that we've gotten. There are some races that do some things better. So, for example, the Chi have much better hologram technology. But in general, across the board, Andalites are probably above everyone else on average. I think that's probably safe to say. They're also scientists. And I talked earlier about why they gave the Yeerks what they did, or why Zero gave the Yeerks what they did. And part of that was because they were studying the Yeerks. And as much as they may try to live together with these other races, their primary purpose is to study these creatures. And that seemed to be the case with the Yeerks, as well as all the other creatures, like the Hawk-Bajir, for instance. When Zero and Owlja and their extended family went down to the Hawk-Bajir world, it was basically to study these creatures, even though nobody really cared about them. And it all goes into scientific journals. Much like we humans have, we have scientific journals. So basically it's a separate entity to... Put it this way, Google. Right, you've got the main bit of Google, but you've also got Google Scholar, which basically eliminates all the riff-raff and focuses purely on scientific journals, which are peer-reviewed. So somebody writes a journal, it then gets sent off, and a whole bunch of other scientists will check it to make sure that there's nothing wrong with it before it's then accepted into the scientific lexicon. And of course, that's not a done deal then, because the thing about science is never assume you're right. At no point should you ever say, right, the science is settled, because it never is. It's always changing. So that's the scientific process, and it looks like the Andalites do something very similar, where they've got a big collection of scientific journals that can be updated as time goes on, and that's how they accumulate knowledge. And part of the warrior culture almost seems to be a part of that. They want to explore different worlds, so they need to be warriors, they need to have a big military in order to do that, so they can study further and increase their knowledge. That brings us neatly onto the technology that they use to travel the stars. It took Andalites 3 millennia to breach the confines of the homeworld with a simple combustion rocket. Our race matured greatly before Z-space was discovered. We were ready for the challenges. We were prepared for zero-dimensional travel and communication. Faster-than-light travel is an impossibility. Not even the Andalites can do it. That is why we tunnel into zero space. Everything was spinning, wildly, out of control. I could feel the artificial gravity weaken. The stabilizers had failed. It took humans only 66 years to go from inventing the first flying machine to landing on the moon. It took Andalites almost 3 times as long. Andalites are capable of travelling into zero space, which is, for want of a better way of putting it, the next level up from ordinary space. You know, they just sort of get a clothespin and pinch normal space together so that they could just travel from one point to the other without the whole gap in between. Something like that. Even though it also takes time to travel through. What are you doing, computer? Even though it still apparently takes time and distance to travel through zero space, so we'll get into an analysis about zero space in the future. But just know, for now, that Andalites took quite a while to do it. They took longer than humans did to do it, but then again we talked about Andalite and against human years earlier and came to the conclusion that the Andalite year is a longer period than the Earth year. So maybe that comes into play there. But you know, who knows? They aren't capable of faster-than-light travel, hence why they have to tunnel through zero space. So they're not perfect, Andalites. They're not perfect. If you didn't already know. But now, of course, the Andalites are so comfortable with space travel, so accomplished, that they've turned it into one big comfort, and they take their homes with them into space. It was built for Andalites, of course, so most of the floor had once been growing green, red and blue grass. The ceilings had been wonderful holographic images of an Andalite sky. Andalites hate confinement. I knew that about them. I knew they were building a new generation of spacecraft that would be called dome ships. These dome ships would actually have huge artificial parks, grass and trees and open sky. So it wasn't so long ago that the Andalites invented dome ships, which are like the ultimate spaceships, even though they're completely useless in a battle situation. But that's a story for another day. And I will eventually redo the dome ship analysis, because that was so long ago that the way I've done these has changed. So that will come in the future, a proper dome ship analysis video. But the thing about ships and the Andalites is that because they communicate with their thoughts primarily, they do talk with language as well, but primarily they speak with telepathy. They've built their ships to be able to reflect that, and their telepathic thought-speak technology is built into these ships. There weren't a lot of buttons or anything. I wondered if the Andalite controlled the ship with his thoughts. Finally, I risked sending out a mirror wave call. A mirror wave call is apparently something that Axe used while on the dome ship. It took his thought speech and didn't just send it around the ship, it actually beamed it out to other Andalites on the planet, which is an incredible bit of technology. But it's not too much different to other technologies that the Andalites have apparently on these ships. So they can bring up holographic transmissions that take the thought speech of somebody who's on in a completely different part of the galaxy and send it into a ship as a form of communication. An instant later, a holographic Andalite head appeared in midair before us. "Force Commander Prince Galluit Enlilon Esgaruth," the TO said. "Attention! They are very good at getting their communication across, even though all their communication comes from these emotional, hormonal, thought speech things going on. They're able to transmit that instantaneously, or near enough instantaneously, from ship to ship in different parts of a world or in different parts of the galaxy. So it's a pretty efficient and highly advanced system. But not only are they very good at talking to each other, but the Andalites are able to talk to races in completely different parts of the galaxy using translator chips. So Andalites, maybe not all of them, but from what we see, most of them, have translator chips stuck inside their heads, which allows them to understand other races who they might not have come across before. The translator chip, which all members of the Andalite military have implanted in their heads, requires a few minutes to begin to understand new languages. These are weird bits of kit, because you could say that languages are a form of pattern. You know, the language we speak or the language something else speaks is a pattern, if not just on its own, but as a consequence of interaction with other things going on, it forms a pattern. So maybe that's how these translator chips work. But basically every military Andalite, and also Aldra, who I don't think was technically military, so it probably extends further than just the military, they have these translator chips in their head, so they could be listening to an alien in the background who's going, and eventually it'll start sounding like proper speech. "I'm speaking to you Andalites in my own native tongue. That means, hello, how do you do?" It's something like that. Imagine that's how it goes. So yeah, it probably works off of patterns that this translator chip is observing this new language and starts to piece together this puzzle, and eventually it says, right, figured it out, there we go, translated for you. Very useful, very advanced. But the thing is, we say the Andalites are advanced. Did they advance in the same ways that we did? Now here comes the book versus computer controversy. Take a look at these two quotes. "Books are an amazing human invention. They allow instant access to information simply by turning pieces of paper. They are much faster to use than computers. Surprisingly, humans invented books before computers. They do many things backward. There were two other flat rectangles, one mostly covered with bound papers. The bound papers were called books or magazines. Lauren had explained them to me. A sort of extremely primitive computer file. So, which came first, the book or the computer? That's the big Andalite question, isn't it? Because those are two contradictory quotes. And usually I might say, well, it's the Andalite Chronicles that's usually wrong about things, so we'd go with the other option. But what's the other option? The Alien, the book from which everything was practically retconned. So we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, or in this case, a sponge and a really soft place. Which one do you believe? On the one hand, you've got Axe saying, these books are just primitive, or very, very primitive. Oh no, it was Alfanga who said that. He said, these books, they're basically like really, really primitive computer files. And then on the other end, there's Axe saying, this book is like a computer, but a million times better. Which is it? Do Andalites consider books more advanced or computers more advanced? All I know is that they stopped using keyboards a while ago. Andalite computers once had keyboards too, although ours were very different, and it had been centuries since we had used them. We beat you there, Andalites. We've got tablets now. Look, don't need to use keyboards. You 90s book series, you silly. It's not as if humans wouldn't do it in about 10 years' time from the time you published these books. Ha! But that doesn't answer our question, really, does it, Adam? Okay, books or computers first. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that even though the alien is retconned in practically every single way, at least I think the authors were lucid at the time of writing it, because the Andalite Chronicles is just stupid and backwards, and they had a freaking Andalite walking naked into space, you know, so I'm going to side with the alien and say that the Andalites would consider books a more advanced form of a computer. Just because I prefer the alien to the Andalite Chronicles. I mean, what method would you go by? Go on, you tell me. This is the big debate, and we'll probably do a big vote on it at some point. So just think about it and then come back to me. But for now, let's move on. The Morphing technology is the crown jewel of Andalite science. It is a piece of Andalite technology that the Yeerks do not have, the Andalite explained. A technology that enables us to pass unnoticed in many parts of the universe. The power to morph. We have never shared this power, but your need is great. The crown jewel of Andalite science is, of course, the morphing technology. Not dome ships, you know, the thing they've just invented. No, that's rubbish. It actually is. The morphing technology is, quite frankly, yes, a very, very superb bit of technology that humans probably won't invent for, well, going by the keyboards thing, another 10 years, maybe. Mate, if it happens, you're going to come back to this video in 10 years and say, God damn, he predicted it. Yes. It'll probably just be some AI nightmare, won't it? We will cover the morphing technology in a bigger analysis further down the line, but for the purposes of this video, yes, it is an amazing piece of technology that the Andalites have created, and it revolves around DNA. And as much as we say that the Arn are the biggest biological whiz kids on the block, or at least they used to be before they got wiped out, the Andalites have shown that they are pretty damn good at doing that. And I'd say it's actually more of a feat to do the morphing technology than to create biological specimens such as the Hobbies. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that the Andalite technology of morphing is beyond pretty much most things we've seen elsewhere in this series. It's incredible. But let's put a foot on the proverbial brakes now and just look at some miscellaneous technology that we see that the Andalites are capable of using, starting with holograms. It beamed the holographic picture and the force field down through the roof of the banquet hall. It took enormous, unimaginable amounts of energy. Especially with inferior Yeerk technology, Axe had said snidely. Andalite technology would do it better, of course. Andalites are capable of combining holograms and force fields, and Axe says as much here. He also says how much better it is than the Yeerk system. And what's the Yeerk system here? They've made a hole in a banquet hall roof and beamed down a force field that blocks off people from going outside in, but not necessarily inside out. And yes, and it's a perfectly visible pillar from the outside. So yeah, that's pretty advanced technology, but Axe is like, rubbish, we could do that easily. We could, because eventually it runs out of power near the top, and he's like, no, we could power it for another extra mile if we really wanted to. So apparently they've got very good force field and hologram technology. Apparently as well, we pale in comparison when it comes to radar. Radar. Is that the human tool that bounces radio beams off objects? I don't mean to offend, but any Andalite child could build a radar cloak from the pieces of his toys. Somehow you are grinding my nerves, Axe, Rachel said grumpily. This happens a lot throughout the series, where Axe says, that technology is child's play. And we also learned something new in this quote here, so it's a double whammo. And that is that Andalite juveniles have toys. And using those toys, they can probably create radar cloaks. So make of that what you will. But yeah, apparently radar is such a primitive technology for the Andalites. I mean, the radar cloak is, they probably replaced it with the previous example we had, which was some sort of hologram force field emitter. That's probably the more advanced form that we're talking about here, because he's talking about radar cloak, which obviously cloaks you from radar. So yeah, that probably is related in some way. Another thing is the Gleet biofilters, which the Yeerks use throughout the series, but Axe explains is actually a piece of Andalite technology. We're lucky to just be blinded. A Gleet biofilter destroys all life forms whose DNA is not entered into the computer controls. Andalite technology, of course. The Yeerks must have stolen the specifications. They have the Gleet biofilter, which is able to find an organism and say what is its genetic pattern. It belongs to this, for want of a better way of putting it, it belongs to this species, therefore we permit it. Lila, please. Doesn't belong to the desired organism, so we eliminate that. And the Yeerks obviously took that technology, so it was probably on one of the initial ships that they stole from the Yeerk homeworld, like one of the 4 fighters or the transport ships. And they probably took that. But that was an Andalite piece of technology. Again, it comes down to DNA, and it actually senses DNA from an independent source. So that's, you know, it's big technology, big tech. You know, you like that. It's a bit vicious, but it's basically a big fly zapper, isn't it? And finally, let's talk about Andalite weapons. You know, the thing that they use frequently. Let's have a look at the variety of big Andalite bazookas. Fusion bomb, I asked. Then I laughed. I know I shouldn't, but you have to admit it. It was funny. A fusion explosive? That's what it was. I assumed it was a small proton shift weapon, at least. Fusion is only used in children's toys. You know, to make the little dolls speak and so on. Marker was correct in stating that nuclear weapons, fairly primitive explosives by Andalite standards, are very difficult for the average person to procure. Aldria discovered that her own fellow Andalites had created a virus targeted to kill the Hawk-Bajir. It was a cold-blooded, military-minded decision. We're mostly working on implications here, such as the small proton shift weapon, which is like an advanced form of a fusion bomb that, you know, Andalite kids used in their toys, much like radar. Basically a similar story, isn't it? But we know that they also create the Q virus, the quantum virus, which is a type of militaristic weapon, a biological weapon that the Andalites used. Yeah, they, you know, the stuff like we have, nuclear weapons, is very small child's play to the Andalites. They probably have a super mega deluxe deluclear weapon somewhere that could blow up a planet with like a freaking Kamehameha blast, you know. But yeah, they got big old weapons, and they ain't afraid to use them, I'm pretty sure. So that's the technology side pretty much covered now. That was a shorter section. So what are we going to move on to next? I think we should finally get round to looking at the history of the Andalites. So go get yourself another cup of tea, have a bit of a break for 5 minutes maybe, and let's have a look at the history of the Andalites. We've looked at present day Andalites in their whole, in their glory, from their morphological appearance to their ecology, to their technology, their demeanour, their politics, their space travel. We've covered all that necessary stuff. We've even looked at the way they communicate with each other, with other races. But how did they come to be the way that they are? So let's travel back in time. Let's have a look at a series of quotes that covers the history of the Andalite people. We were free roaming herd animals to begin with. I mean, that's how we evolved. Millions of years ago, Andalites moved in vast herds, which would split off into smaller herds at different times of the year. Then, gradually, we got used to forming smaller herds. Families, really. Each family made its scoop, and we each held our own grazing lands. All this Andalite environment you see is part of my family's grazing land. We no longer have predators to attack us, she said, but evolution does not just throw away adaptations that were necessary once. The animals we evolved from were prey for millions of years. They lived in vast herds, always watched by hungry predators. This was before we developed our tail blades, and we had no protection but speed. We still feel the need to watch for predators. It may be a million years before we lose that instinct. Over the course of millions of years, the Andalites evolved from simple, grazing herd animals into the Andalites we see today. We've talked about cities previously before, or we're going to do it later, but we know that the Andalites used to live in cities, but they moved away from cities and back to grazing lands effectively. So we started out with massive herds of these blue centaur-like beings charging across the plains, and they started to split off in smaller groups. They would form scoops, each with their own grazing land. And then eventually that grew into cities where they clumped together, forming spaceports, which was probably like their industrial revolution. And then after a while they got fed up with that, broke off and went back to the scoop system. And that seems to be the general trajectory of how it's gone. We've talked about how the Andalites are prey animals and how that might have shaped everything about them. We've covered that at various parts throughout this AniLysis, how it affects their xenophobic nature, their technology, the way that they sleep, the way that they do anything is formed by them being a naturally prey species. And they were a prey species when a certain Mr. Tumin came along to the Andalite home world and pushed his influence into proceedings. "I am an Ellimist," he said, speaking with an actual voice, "as your Andalite friend guessed." Axe was shaking so badly he looked like he might fall down. "Be at peace, Andalite," the Ellimist said. "Look at your human friends. They do not fear me." "They don't know what you are," Axe managed to say. The Ellimist smiled. "Neither do you. All you know are the fairy stories your people tell to children." This is why the Ellimist features so heavily in Andalite mythology and all these stories that they tell their kids. The Ellimist was there at the dawning of the Andalite race, from the herd creatures, the scoop creatures, the primitive scoop creatures, to the creatures we see today. So let's look at how he amalgamated himself into the story of the Andalites. Let's have a look at his first experience of the Andalite home world. The body was supple, swift, strong. The tail could be used to stab at anything approaching me from behind. I was no fool. I knew this tail meant that there were predators in this ecosystem, but I was not overly concerned. Their reaction to me was instantaneous. They charged me at top speed, surrounded me, and twisted around awkwardly to aim their pointed tail blades at me. 3 stubby blades quivered nervously within a few feet of my vulnerable throat. The 3 creatures flashed a series of complex hand signals at one another. If I'd had my full multitude with me, I'd have been able to instantly decipher this gestural language. I could sense quite clearly their emotional states. It wasn't just the body language. They seemed capable of projecting a sort of basic emotional language by some means I could not discern. "I'm not an enemy," I said. I said it without thinking, automatically accessing my communications system, a system that was part of my other body, no part of this form. And yet I saw a subtle relaxation on the part of the creatures. They had heard me, or at least heard the emotional tone. The first of my brothers reached the monster. The beast killed 2 effortlessly. It paused to eat, to rip the 2 martyrs apart and swallow them, all but ignoring the brave stabs of their fellows. It was a sadly one-sided battle, and I should have stayed out of it. I had not come to fight, but I was, physically at least, one of these creatures, and there would be very little of the companionship I craved, very little learning, very little relaxation, so long as they were being massacred. I drew my handheld beam weapon and shot the monster in the head. It died and fell in a heap. From that day on, I was a welcomed, revered member of the tribe. This is on the Ellimist's first day. So he comes upon this Andalite tribe, and they come up to him. They're a bit like, "Oh, who's this guy? Who's this guy coming in now?" And they turn around and look to attack him, and they speak to each other with gestures, so probably hand gestures. That's probably why they evolved these little arms, so they can just sort of give it all this bollocks. And they give off this, like we talked about earlier, this emotional language, like they're almost like they're giving off hormones that they're able to speak with. And that's how the Ellimist sort of understands them. And then he introduces them to this thought speak thing, or something akin to thought speak, that the Andalites sort of understand somehow. And then a monster comes along, and all these primitive Andalites are dying, and so the Ellimist thinks, oh, screw this, brings out his laser weapon and kills this monster. And you can probably see why this day went down in Andalite mythology, where this new Andalite just turns up, starts speaking in some weird language, and then kills the monster that's been haunting us for years. It's no wonder that this story probably did go down into folklore, eventually into mythology, and he became, as he said, a revered member of this tribe, and he stayed with them for quite a long time. What we know about the Andalites at this stage is they've probably gone away from being these vast herds. This is probably as they've started to go into smaller groups, smaller scoops. But they haven't quite evolved to be the Andalite we see in this picture, for example, with the tail blade swooping over the top. It's probably only about up to that length there, because they have to turn around awkwardly and jab a really tiny blade at the enemy. So this is before the Andalite tail blade really got a kickstart from evolution, got really kicked into gear and became this long, thick, strong whip, basically, with this massive scythe blade, at least on the males. So that's where we are in history. It's probably a couple million years ago in terms of where we are nowadays, maybe even more. Let's see what happens after this first day of the Ellimist being with the Andalites. They had no name for their race, no special gestural label for their species, only hand words for their tribe. As far as they were concerned, their planet was irrelevant, their species a useless abstraction. They were this tribe, this group, and no more. It was I who came up with the hand word for their race, and, for the benefit of my own word-oriented brain, a spoken name as well. I named them Andalites. I lived with the Andalites for many years, happy years by and large. They were primitive people. Their gestural language consisted of fewer than 200 words or phrases. They had no art, no science, no agriculture. But they had already evolved from pure grazers, herd members, into distinct individuals. They had potential. I lived with them and refused to teach, refused to interfere. On one other occasion I employed my weapon to fend off a monster's attack, but that was all. Aside from that, I was an Andalite, concerned with keeping the fire going, with maintaining the roof of my little scoop, with carefully avoiding overfeeding in dry weather, with tending the trees so that they would drop their delicious leaves at harvest time, with all the simple minutiae of daily life. Some very interesting stuff here. First of all, the name Andalites was Tumin / the Ellimist's name. He named them. This creature, somewhere down the line, just adopted this name that the Ellimist provided them and kept hold of it until today, present day. He did occasionally pop up with some more magic stuff thrown in, but he was basically the Jesus of the Andalites. We get a couple more bits of information in there as well, so we can see that by this point they have started making actual scoops. We see that they eat leaves and they harvest leaves. So at certain times of the year, leaves drop from the trees. They're said to be delicious. So obviously there is that sense of taste to differentiate delicious from not delicious. And these leaves drop down and they eat those leaves rather than just the grass. So it's probably like a treat, or it gives them some other form of nutrition that grass might otherwise not have. But this is probably still millions of years ago, so things might have changed from there, so we're keeping it firmly in the history section of this video. Let's move on now and see what other shenanigans the Ellimist gets up to with the Andalites. I married. Her name was Tree. The Andalites only used a dozen or so names: tree, water, star, grass, and so on. Probably 20% of the females in the tribe were named Tree. We had a child, Star. But Star died soon after birth of a disease that attacks the Andalite young. As I helped bury Tree's body according to the ritual that would allow her spirit to strengthen the grass, I knew my time with the Andalites was over. Andalite naming conventions have come a long way since probably millions of years ago. So it just started as tree, star, river, lake, wall, maybe not wall, soil. And now it's all the way to Aximilias Gruthistil, you know, standard, you know. It's come a long way. Whether the Ellimist influenced that, it doesn't look like it, because he left the Andalites pretty much at this point when his wife died, and he couldn't justify sticking around anymore, because else why would he? You know, they obviously have age limits, so he didn't want to make it look any weirder than it probably already was. You know, he was already Jesus. He didn't want to be a bit more than that. You know, tried to keep it humble. Yeah. Yeah, that's when he left the Andalites to their own devices, but he had his impact. We're also introduced a bit more of the funeral ritual that we sort of tentatively discussed earlier. They bury their dead, and that is to strengthen the grass, which is basically what happens, you know, fertilizer and all that sort of stuff. You know, that's how it works. You know, the worms come along and do their thing, and they fertilize. Yeah. It gets a bit gruesome, but we know how that works. So let's now move a bit further on. Somewhere down the line, the Andalites became the dominant race on the planet. For millions of years, we Andalites have not felt the pressure from other species. With our speed and our tails, we are without physical peers on our home world. This would have taken place after the Ellimist got involved, because there were monsters that attacked the Andalites and were clearly physically more capable than the Andalites with their pokey tails. So, at some point after the Ellimist intervened, the Andalites became the dominant force on the planet. And that's probably when the real intelligence, the technology came forward. And eventually, as we've previously mentioned, they started to make cities and then decided, actually, no, that's not for us. Long ago, we had cities, I explained. Once we evolved to form families, we began to study science and nature. And again, over millions of years, we learned to build things. You know, weapons and vehicles that let us fly over the land, and communicators for extending the reach of thought speak. Scoops became larger, families joined with other families, building grew. Soon we had thousands of Andalites all crammed together without enough grazing space. But we were learning space travel at the same time. Still, we weren't happy. We knew something was wrong. We broke down our cities, divided the land, and went back to life in simple family scoops. The book sort of vaguely goes over, it was millions of years that we went from being primitive to flying in spacecraft. It is very vague, and when you add this quote into it, it just makes it even more difficult to understand. What were Andalites like 300-400 years ago? We were relatively backward technologically, Axe sniffed, but we had managed to discover cleaning agents. So on the one hand, over millions of years we invented vehicles and spacecraft and hover cars. What were you doing 300-400 years ago? Well, we made dish soap. I mean, what do you make of that? Where do you start? Where do you end? What is it? Okay, over millions of years did you do it, or was it recently that you invented space travel? Was that before you were able to clean your own spacesuits? I can't figure it out. Good luck trying. But yes, apparently 300-400 years ago, they were inventing cleaning agents. Whatever. Anyway, we got the city thing where it says they built cities and then decided, actually, screw this, and went back to living in family scoops. Which, honestly, I wouldn't be too fussed. I don't live in a city, thank God. But I would hate to live in a city. I would hate it. It is just so cramped and awful. I don't know how people can do it. They must be just, like, sadists. But yeah, if only we could go back to living just in our own little villages or little hamlets. It'd be great. Apparently the Andalites do it and they're well advanced. So, you know, give it 10 years and we'll be doing the same thing. We'll be getting rid of cities. Yeah, you just you wait, you know. London will be going back to a 3-hut village. Yeah, that would be the day. It's also interesting to point out, right, it took millions of years for them to grow their technology, which is an awful long time, by the way. Humans in their present form have been around for hundreds of thousands of years. Millions of years is a big deal. It's a long, long time. Try to picture it in your head. Try to imagine living a million years. It's incomprehensible. Apparently Andalites have been, a million years ago they invented the Ford, and then 500,000 years ago they put a steering wheel on it. They took their time, but they got there in the end. But we covered this earlier, the year, the date that the Andalites are currently in. Let's remind ourselves of that. Andalite date, year 8561.2, Earth date 1966. Andalite dates go back 8,500 years. I can't square this circle. So they've been building technology for millions of years, and yet their calendars only start 8,500 years ago. I doubt it's anything like our calendar. So here in the West, we're in the year 2024. Why is that? Because we're largely a Christianity-based civilization, and Jesus was killed in the year 0. So that's why you get 2024 AD, which I believe is a Latin phrase. But it's based on the Christian religion. And that's why we are where we are now. Why is the Andalite calendar in the year 8,500 when it's been made very, very clear that the Andalites have been doing their thing for millions of years? Why is it just 8,500? What happened 8,500 years ago? Was there an Andalite religious figure? But I thought that was the Ellimist. He was their Jesus. And that was millions of years ago. So they just decided one day, right, screw it, we're just going to start the freaking calendar over again. Right, we're starting at 0, go. Maybe it was the year they invented driftball, and we've had driftball for 8,500 years now. Let's go with that, yeah? They thought it was such an important technology. Right, guys, we've just invented this freaking game, right? I think we should start the calendar again. That's that important. Let's go with that. It's been 8,500 years since driftball was invented. I'm going with that. Probably my most stupid headcanon. How long are we into this video? Let's move on. And this is one thing that's worth mentioning is that Andalites used to go to war with each other. In the past, Andalites made war on other Andalites. This sort of goes back to what we were talking about with what the Ellimist saw, where he said the tribe is the tribe, and all they know is that they are part of this tribe and that is their world. This was probably about the same time that these tribes were going to war with each other, so that probably is what happened. The Ellimist doesn't mention that, but I can only imagine that was going on in the background. At least maybe not then, but maybe further into the future when they were getting a little more technologically developed. Maybe they did start warring with each other. But there's a very mysterious thing that appears in the very last book. Very mysterious, and this is it. Once they were gone, Kasaf said, "The Kelbrid claim an empire that borders the far reaches of our own technology. They are dangerous, warlike, aggressive, but also very trustworthy. We have a treaty with one simple proviso. We do not enter Kelbrid space. They do not enter ours." Was this alien vessel a Kelbrid ship? We do not know. We have never seen a Kelbrid. They, likewise, have no direct knowledge of us. Are they in league with the Blade ship? There is no way to know. I was getting impatient. These Kelbrids would have reason to want a live Andalite. First rule of intelligence, know your enemy. Yes. So, what are you doing about it? He looked very closely at me. Nothing. We cannot enter Kelbrid space without starting a war. No Andalite ship, no Andalite warrior could enter Kelbrid space. The risk is far too great, even to attempt to rescue Prince Aximili. The Kelbrids. This is a big, big mystery. What is the deal with the Kelbrids? There is a border in space that the Kelbrids and the Andalites live either side of, and they cannot cross the border. This wall has been there for so long that the Andalites and Kelbrids apparently don't even know what each other looks like. That's a big deal. So you have these enemies that you dislike so much that you stopped anything from crossing this to the point where you don't even know what each other looks like. That's got to be a long time ago, especially considering that KSAF is saying, well, we know that they're trustworthy. Well, you don't even know what they look like, so how can you know that they're trustworthy? Add 2 and 2, mate. Whatever the case, I get the feeling that the Kelbrids were at war with the Andalites in their in the ancient days. Maybe this is why the calendar is dated at 8,500. Maybe something happened there. Because I work in I do a fair bit of fan fiction in this with the Kelbrids. And oh, is this a spoiler? I don't think I've written this bit yet. Have I written this bit yet? I'm going to avoid it. But put it this way, perhaps there's a reason that because of these Kelbrids, you know, they got completely blocked off, and maybe the Andalites, for whatever reason, said, right, we're just going to restart the calendar. We're just going to start everything afresh here. We're not going to talk about what happened before. The year starts at 0 now. Maybe there's some mysterious reason there. It's a thing I'm playing with, but just so you're aware, this idea of it being the reason for the calendar is not something I've previously considered, so I'm not spoiling anything there. I'm now just theorising. I still like my driftball idea, yes. But either way, the Kelbrids are this mysterious being over the space wall that we can't see. And yet somehow they want to take an Andalite prisoner. Go read my fan fiction, you'll find out all about this sort of stuff. Animorphs number 55, The Interrogation. Onwards to, I'm going to be writing number 65 soon. So there's a lot there. Anyway, that is that section, the history of the Andalites and the various mysteries that come with it. So the next section is talking about, well, after the Yeerk War. So this is your final chance to get a cup of tea. There's not much left of this video from this point, so yeah, get yourself comfortable for the last portion of this Andalite analysis. So now we approach the end of this massive Andalite analysis. And let's not forget that there is so much more to the Andalites that we haven't covered here, mostly because it will fall under the umbrella of different analyses videos, such as the Morphing technology, the various Andalite ships, and Andalite individuals like Prince Zero, Zero's kindness. There's all sorts more stuff to go into, but we're looking at the overarching stuff. We know that the Andalites were involved at the start of the Yeerk War. They basically started it. What with Zero's kindness, that will be in a separate analysis. We know that they were sort of bouncing around during the Yeerk War while it was going on Earth with the Animorphs. But they didn't really do anything, they just sort of held off in the background, and anything that does happen will fall under its own analysis, like Unit Zero, for example, Gfinlan and Myrtle, the Innate homeworld, or the Rakam Guru conflict. So this is all stuff that will get covered in separate videos. But now we can look at what happened to the Andalites after the Yeerk War. So they came down to Earth once the Animorphs had effectively defeated the Yeerks and entered various negotiations. And that is what happened. That is what caused the sort of things we see in these quotes after the Yeerk War. Axe worked out technology transfer deals with some of the big corporations. They have to keep it slow because if you just dump 100 years of technological advances overnight, the stock market goes nuts. It worked out okay though. The Andalites can definitely teach us a lot about computer architecture. But it was Microsoft and Sony and Adobe and Nintendo that came up with the killer apps. I mean, the new Palm pilots will be actual pilots. The Andalites flatly refused to let us share their weapons technology. But NASA has had a definite revival. The first human zero-space vehicle will be built jointly by Boeing and Lockheed and be ready for launch in 3 years. Homo sapiens was going to the stars. Look out, universe, we're coming to build a Starbucks near you. After the war, there were deals made between the Andalite people and humanity. Maybe because of the amount of guilt that the Andalites carried from the Yeerk War. Maybe they thought, oh Jesus, these humans are so quickly advancing that someday they might actually, you know, catch up to us. And if they're bitter, it's not going to go well. So maybe getting them on the good side. You know, throw a few bits of technology, you know, throw them that little bit. We're not going to give them the big stuff, you know, but give them a few little scraps. And from that, according to the book series, it wouldn't be long before humans were themselves entering zero space, getting space travel, which of course is a shame that we didn't have in our timeline because, well, I mean, Elon Musk is almost there. Give him time, he's going to take us to Mars. That's the hope anyway. And yeah, it just took a few more years extra. So come on, Elon, get those rockets going. I do just reckon a lot of it is down to the Andalite guilty conscience, because the humans aren't, us humans, you know, we're an investigative, inquisitive bunch. So eventually we'd come around and say, you know, you really are actually the dickheads of the universe. So either you give us stuff or we are going to badmouth you to the end of time. And we've got some really naughty sweary words we could throw your way. So the Andalites like, yeah, fine, whatever. And the Andalites do get some deals out of it as well. So they send a lot of different people down to Earth. Here's a few examples. The Andalite ambassador to the United Nations took charge of her body. What was left of it? Andalite tourism was the coming thing. The numbers were limited. Interstellar travel isn't cheap, you know. But the big thing was for wealthy or influential Andalites to come to Earth and acquire human morphs. Then it was off to the mall, food courts, to raid the Cinnabon and Mrs. Fields. You get an Andalite ambassador, which seems pretty obvious, you know, if you're going to form an allies with between humans and Andalites, then you'd probably have an ambassador. Going either way. So probably actually you had a human ambassador go to the Andalite homeworld. That would make sense if you're going to send an Andalite ambassador to Earth, you know, for relations, then theoretically, am I wrong? Am I wrong? You'd send an ambassador the other way. So you've probably got some humans living on the Andalite homeworld. It never gets mentioned in the series, but it makes logical sense, I think. Yeah, tell me if I'm being silly here. Other than the usual forms of silly I tend to take. And then you get tourists who come down with the morphing ability to experience the sense of human taste. And if that wasn't the most obvious thing in the world, then my name is Delilah. Thing is, unfortunately for the xenophobic Andalites, they got a taste of their own medicine. Terrorists had begun to attack Andalite tourists and free Hobbies, and the Andalites had agreed to make a single morphing cube available, on condition that it remain in Andalite custody and be used only for anti-terror forces. You know, it's really sad that the terrorists target Hobbies because, let's face it, they haven't really done anything wrong and it's a travesty. And in a way it is a travesty as well that happens to Andalites, but you lot are xenophobic as bugger. So forgive me if I see an irony in that. But still, yes, that is a tragedy, a travesty that Andalite tourists get targeted by terrorists, okay? It's just, this is fictional, so I'm not going to get too upset. I'm not going to cry like real tears over it. But you see what I mean. But yeah, there's some terrorists are going to go be terrorists. It's unfortunate. And let's hope they get lengthy fictional prison sentences. How do Andalites get transported around on Earth if they're not in their usual Andalite spacecraft? Well, they can't exactly go on buses, can they? 2 Andalites, not 1, rode in the horse trailer towed behind a Humvee. These Andalites had never taken offence at this unusual mode of transport, and it worked better than trying to cram them into a car. So they're not too offended by being put in horse trailers to be wheeled about the place, here, there and everywhere. And that was Ksath and Mendrash, by the way, in book 54, The Beginning. The last time we see or already hear about the Andalites in the Animal series is when Marco is suggesting that they're allowing the humans to have more morphing cubes. Now, what would it be that would convince the Andalites to give out more morphing cubes? Again, it's very, very predictable. More therapy? I think I feel another best-selling book coming on. Oh man, Oprah would eat that up. And you know the Andalites are saying now that they may make morphing technology more widely available on Earth. I frowned. Really? Why? They want a Krispy Kreme franchise back on the homeworld. You have a fair number of Andalites who possess a human morph now, all back home after their tour on Earth, still looking for a donut. Of course, the Andalites are convinced by food to give out more morphing technology. But we don't actually see that happening, because that's really the last time we see the Andalites. And that is the last quote I'm going to give you for today. It's been a long old video, hasn't it? But I hope you've made it through. If you did it all in one go, fair bloody play to you. Go step outside and get some vitamin D. I certainly need to at this point. It's been a crazy couple of months just getting this together. I mean, it's not too much longer than the Hobbies AniLysis, but there's still a lot of research that goes into it, and I am knackered. But this will allow me now to concentrate on other videos, so you don't have to put up my silly little gaming videos anymore. Well, not for a while, I hope. Because I know what the next AniLysis is. Because if things look slightly different in this video you're seeing right now, it's because my video camera ran out of power, and I didn't realise until I finished the recording. So I know what's coming up in the next AniLysis already, and I've got it recorded, because that's how I do it. But anyway, the Andalites, what have we covered today? Morphology, ecology, biology, organs, technology, culture was a big one, intelligence. We've covered everything. The history, what they did after the war, and I believe we've covered everything. There will be a few bits that we probably have missed, and please do let me know in the comments, and if there's enough I'll do an addendum video after all is said and done. But I think we've got down the basics, haven't we? We've covered the Andalites from tip to tail, and I hope you've enjoyed the viewing. Now, I know what's coming up in the next AniLysis because, as I mentioned previously, I've already done this, and I span the wheel. In fact, I'll bring up the video now. Here it is. So, oh. Yeah, because what I do is, where's that gone? I get my OBS up, I film myself spinning the wheel so I can put it up bigger on the screen for you so you can see it a bit clearer. And I did that, and you know what? I got to the end of the wheel spinning and I was praising the Lord. Praising the Lord. Because I was begging, fingers crossed, everything crossed. I thought I'd jinxed it. I said, please just give me a small AniLysis. Please. Don't give me a freaking Rachel or a Visa 3. Give me a nice small one that I can do the research for in 2 minutes, be done with it, and move on to the next video. So you don't have to watch me playing bloody gaming videos anymore. And this is the video, so you'll see what it comes up with. It will come up on screen now as well. But yeah, you won't get my initial natural reaction to come on, fast forward a bit. Where are we? Yeah, okay. It was the flower. It was the flower. Whatever the frick the flower is. And it was an emotional reaction. It was very emotional. I was praising the Lord for giving me the flower for the next AniLysis. The flower! The flower. What even is the flower? Sounds like a Pokemon, doesn't it? But that's what the next AniLysis is going to be. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've stuck around. I hope you've learned a few things. I hope you maybe just came into this video thinking, how high can an Andalite jump, or does the fur cover the whole body? And you came into the video, you used the chapter system at the bottom of the video, and you found what you were looking for. I hope this video has been valuable to you. That's what this is all about. It's about giving you a tool. I am the Animorphs library. So thank you very much for watching. Tune in next time to learn about the flower. It's how posh people say flower. They have watched Mary Berry. I always found it funny because, you know, when you're making a cake or bread or something, you use flour, don't you? She says, and then you put in the flour. So we're covering Mary Berry in the next episode. So thank you very much for watching, and we're going to be back with the Animorphs videos. Yay! No more gaming nonsense, even though I do really enjoy that, and it's very easy to make, hence why it was going up in the meantime. Thank you very much for watching. I shall see you next time, somewhere else in the Animorphs universe. Ta-ra!